Ok, cominciamo in italiano, saluti di benvenuto, quindi benvenuti, dovremmo essere già in streaming, iniziamo la seconda giornata del workshop e prima di iniziare vorrei ringraziare il personale tecnico che è sempre stato molto efficiente e gentile nei nostri confronti e senza il loro aiuto sicuramente questo evento non sarebbe potuto andare così smooth, diciamo. So, welcome back to this second day of our workshop about Anthropocene. Thank you for being here again. And I think that we can move directly to the first speaker of the day, who is Paco Melia. He's professor of ecology at the Politecnico of Milano. And the topic of his talk is the anthropogenic metabolism in industrial ecology. Please.
Meanwhile, good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop about the Anthropocene. As Andrea kindly told, I'm professor of ecology. I teach ecology and sustainability topics at the Politecnico di Milano, and my background is in environmental engineering, and I got a PhD in ecology, and now work on ecological modeling for sustainable management of biological resources, life cycle assessment, environmental impact assessments, this kind of topics. And let me see if I can manage this tool. Okay. So I would start with a few examples just to understand better why we need to take into account life cycles, not only in the biological sciences, but also in engineering and design, and every time, for instance, we want to act as responsible consumers. Because also products have life cycles, and it's important to take them into account if we want to evaluate the environmental impacts of the goods and services we use. So let's start from a common problem we have to face when we go to the supermarket, for instance, and have to choose whether to buy water in a plastic bottle or a glass bottle, or to avoid at all to buy water at the supermarket and just buy a refillable glass bottle that we can fill home with tap water. Well, which is the best environmental friendly option? I would defend the last option, the one of using a refillable bottle, but actually the answer depends on the conditions where we are. For instance, where we live, where does the water we want to drink come from, which kind of materials and where they come from are used to produce the bottles, and the end of life of those bottles, whether they're simply landfilled, or they're burnt, or the materials are recycled, or the bottles are reused. So we have to dig deeper into the life cycle of a product to understand what are their actual environmental burdens. In a perspective that we usually call from the cradle to the grave of a product. Let's take another example. When we have to choose a new light bulb to replace a broken one, should we buy a traditional incandescent lamp? Should we buy a more energy efficient fluorescent lamp or a LED lamp? How can we understand which is the best option from the environmental viewpoint? Actually, over last decades, electronic devices such as light bulbs have improved very much the energy efficiency. But this has a cost. It means that we reduce power use during the use phase of the device, but we need more complex electronic devices that require more energy and more materials to be built. So we can't just look at the use phase of a product, but we also have to look at the production phase and the end-of-life phase. Okay? So we have to take a whole life cycle perspective to understand that better. If we go on with this comparison between the two alternative light bulbs, we should first of all make the comparison fair, because we want to compare two products that have the same, that guarantee us the same service. So for instance, the same amount of light. So this in terms of power supply, well, we need two different light bulbs, because an incandescent light bulb with a power, let's say, of 54 watts is equivalent in number of lumen, so in the amount of light to produce, to a fluorescent lamp that consumes only 14 watts. So we have to take two light bulbs that provide the same light. But another point we have to take into account is that they don't have the same lifespan, or at least the same expected lifespan. The nominal lifespan of a traditional incandescent light bulb is about 1,000 hours versus a nominal life span of a compact fluorescent bulb, which is about 6,000 hours. So if we want to compare the same amount of light over the same time horizon, we have to take, for instance, 6 incandescent light bulbs to compare them with just one compact fluorescent lamp. Then we look at, in this case, we look at energy consumption. How much energy is used to produce one of those compact fluorescent lamps and the 6 traditional incandescent bulbs. We see that the amount of energy to produce the fluorescent lamp is much higher than the one which is needed to produce one single incandescent lamp. But we have said that we have to compare one fluorescent lamp with 6 incandescent lamps, so we have to multiply 0.05 kilowatt hours, which is the energy to produce one incandescent bulb, times 6. Okay, and still, however, we see that the energy to produce a fluorescent lamp is more than 3 times the energy used to build a traditional lamp. When we come, however, to the use phase and we multiply the power necessary to produce light for the first lamp and the second lamp, we multiply this power times the lifespan, the entire lifespan of the lamp, we get very different results, because the balance is very much in favor of the copper fluorescent lamp. That's actually the reason why the European Union is pushing towards the replacement of old energy inefficient light bulbs with new ones with higher and higher energy efficiency. Because if we make the balance over the production and use phase, we see that it is very much in favor of the fluorescent lamp. Of course, we should take into account also the end of life. And even this is not included in this slide because the actual amount of energy used to get rid of this kind of bulbs after the end of the working life very much depend, for instance, on the waste management system you have in your city. So it can change from place to place and depends on how the materials are reused, recycled, or eliminated. Okay, but in any case, I would say that in most cases the balance would still be in strong favor of energy efficient light bulbs. There are other points, however, that are worth taking into account. For instance, the actual kind of use we do of a specific device. For instance, fluorescent lamps, the lifespan of a fluorescent lamp is very much sensitive to the use we do. How many clicks? Basically, perhaps you already know if you have looked at the label of light bulbs in the supermarket, there's a limited number of clicks a lamp can sustain. So the frequency with which we turn on and off the lamp affects the duration of the lamp itself. So if 6,000 hours is the expected nominal lifetime you find on the level of a fluorescent lamp, this would decrease quite a lot if you use this lamp instead in a living room where you're expected to click on and off, to switch on and off the lamp, let's say every 3 hours. If you install this lamp in a hallway, for instance, where you continuously click and click and click, it will last much less. 1 order of magnitude shorter becomes the lifetime. So the balance changes completely. Another critical point is that the energy we spare by using energy efficient devices can be produced in a place and with technologies which are different from those used to produce the lamp. Let's say that, as it happens quite frequently, the energy efficient lamp is produced in a country, usually a developing country, where environmental legislation is softer towards pollution, where the energy mix for the generation of electric power is more carbon intensive, then the increase of energy that we need for the production phase would determine environmental impacts that are higher than the decrease of energy used during the working phase of the device. For instance, if we install it and use it in a country where a significant fraction of the power is generated with renewable sources. So the balance is complex, and that's why we have to go deeper in understanding the production, the use, the end-of-life phases of a product. And that's why we need, let's say, a metabolic approach. We had to do balances just like we do in life sciences of energy and materials. And this is the approach that has been emerging in the last decades and that we call industrial metabolism, or the discipline, the multidisciplinary field of research, which is industrial ecology. Industrial ecology, it's basically a field of research at the interface between different sciences, such as environmental sciences, biological sciences, engineering, design, and it tries to apply a metabolic approach to the analysis of production systems. Let's go back to the very beginning of the history of metabolic studies. Probably the first who studied the human metabolism was an Italian physician, Santorio Santorio, who in the late 16th century, beginning of the 17th, created a weighing chair that he used to weigh himself, to weigh what he ate and drank, and what he eliminated through excretion and his feces, to make a material balance of the inputs and outputs of his body. And he found that the balance would not close when weighing inputs and outputs. Why? Because his excretion in mass terms was much lower than what he ate and drank. The gap in the balance was what he called perspirazio insensibili. So it was basically the mass of the air he breathed and of the transpiration of water vapor from his body. At that time, it wasn't possible to weigh gases, and so the mass balance didn't close. And this was a starting point of metabolic studies that then extended from humans to organisms to entire ecosystems, and was then in the second half of the 20th century applied also to anthropogenic systems. And this is a pictorial example of the urban metabolism of the city of Brussels, where scientists tried to make a complete balance of energy and materials in input and output in a complex system such as a big city, trying to point out the main criticalities in terms of sustainability of this energy and matter balance in terms of pollution, resource consumption, etc. And in the, let's say, in the last 3-4 decades, this approach has grown quite a lot and has been extended to industrial ecosystems, to the analysis of industrial metabolism. This, for instance, is an example of the socioeconomic metabolism of steel at the global scale. I don't go into details, but it's just a material balance of what is taken from the lithosphere and goes to production in different countries, what is recycled and what is lost back to the environment. So we can make global balances, of course also local ones, to understand better how different material cycles across industrial ecosystems. I call them industrial ecosystems because actually they are quite similar to natural ecosystems. In that we have energy and material exchanges, flows through different compartments with losses of energy, dissipation of energy, just like we can observe in living organisms and natural ecosystems. These two flow diagrams compare what happens in the body of a living organism that ingests, assimilates different substances and produces its own biomass and then accumulates biomass for growth or reproduction. And the same goes on in industrial systems where we have different processes, cascading processes, where materials are transformed into from raw materials to components and that then are assembled into products. And this and the following flow diagrams compare two possible, let's say, ideal ecosystems, a natural one with energy and materials inputs. Energy is uptaken by plants that will let it enter into the system. Energy and materials will then go through the different compartments from primary producers to consumers to decomposers, etc. And the same basically happens in industrial ecosystem. This is, for instance, the life cycle of copper from the mining to the smelting, which is basically a primary production because we use energy and copper mineral to produce copper lingots, then enter different consumer compartments. We produce wire from copper lingots. From copper wire we can produce cables, then will be assembled, for instance, in a personal computer. And then at the end of life of this product, we can have a disassemblage and a recycling of part, at least, of the original material that entered the system. So from the need to analyze in a quantitative and standardized way this kind of flows through industrial ecosystems that has originated a technique that is called material flow analysis, which is a systematic way of analyzing industrial systems from the viewpoint, from the metabolic viewpoint. Okay. This is a very simple example of how a prehistoric man and a modern one would compare in terms of material balances. And we see that, well, basically the material balance of a prehistoric man was mainly based on his own metabolism, while now we have flows, material flows, which are at least the one order of magnitude higher than in the very past. And we have a lot of materials in input and output that are not at all, let's say our metabolism is just a small fraction of this big material flow. This is another example at the global scale instead, so we can apply the same approach to very different scales. It's a global copper cycle. Just to have an idea of the figures at stake, we have here flows which are expressed in gigagrams of copper per year, and this is the total amount of copper we extract from the lithosphere every year. It's 10,000 gigagrams, so quite a lot amount of copper we take from the lithosphere of our planet. We use it, we stock it into the components of different products we use, and at the end of life we manage the waste we produce. We can recycle part of this copper, but let's see that almost 1/3 of the amount of copper we extract from the lithosphere every year is then lost back into the environment, usually in forms that we are not anymore able to reuse or that require a lot of effort to be recovered. Okay, let's now come to a tool, an analytical tool that has become largely used in the last, let's say, 3 decades in industrial ecology, which is which directly originated from materials flow analysis, which is life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is basically a technique aimed to assess in an analytical and systematic way the environmental impacts of a product or services throughout all the stages of its life. So from the cradle to the grave, as I said before. LCA has been standardized over time. It now follows precise reference standards, which are ESO guidelines and norms, and is based basically on 4 main phases: the definition of goal and scope, an inventory analysis, an impact assessment phase, and the final phase of interpretation of the results. Let's go quickly through these phases to understand better this approach. Goal and scope are basically the scoping phase of the analysis, so we wonder why we want to carry out this kind of assessment. This is usually done, for instance, in academies and industries for research and development purposes. It might be useful for green marketing because you can show your consumers that your product has undergone a comprehensive environmental assessment analysis. It's a tool supporting environmental management, sustainable design and architecture, and we can apply it also to plans and programs, so to policy making. The starting point is what we call the functional unit, which is, let's say, the reference to which we apply our analysis. When before we were saying that we had to compare one single fluorescent light bulb with 6 incandescent lamps. It's because they otherwise wouldn't have provided the same function. So the functional unit is a measure of the function of the system we want to study. For instance, it might be if we want to compare the environmental performances of, I don't know, building materials, square meter of wall surface, or if you want to compare different packaging for the same product, such as milk or the water we were talking before, it might be 1 liter of milk. So we cannot compare a half-liter bottle of plastic bottle with 1 liter bottle of glass. We have to take the same amount of milk because we want to compare the same function. Or we can compare different generation technologies for the same kilowatt hour of electricity with wind turbine production, or with a coal plant, or with a hydro generation plant, etc. So the functional unit is our reference, and we also have to set what we call system boundaries. So we have to define the boundaries of the system, because production systems are very complex. If we want to assess the environmental impact of a lamp, for instance, we have to take into account the origin of the raw materials, but we also need, I don't know, a truck to transport those raw materials. This truck will in turn have lamps, and those lamps will require energy and other raw materials, so we can go back as far as we want, but of course we cannot take everything into account, and most probably the contribution to the overall impact will decrease as long as we go farther and farther from our product. So we have to draw some boundaries to our system and study. In principle, those boundaries should be drawn in so that they include only what we call elementary flows. So material or energy entering the system directly from nature, and materials and energy leaving the system that are released back into the environment without further transformations. Okay? Of course, the actual choice of the boundaries depends on the objectives of the analysis and the time and money and willingness we have to analyze deeper and deeper the problem. Then we come to the second phase of a life cycle assessment, which is called the life cycle inventory, and is based on the description, the analysis of the system, its subdivision into the basic unit processes, the description and analysis of all the operating conditions, the identification of all the main energy and material flows, the collection of data. This is usually an important phase and time and money demanding phase. So we can use primary data specific to the production system we are studying. If we have the opportunity to interview the firm, for instance, and ask them how much energy, how much raw materials, etc. they use. In many cases, especially for the processes which are not the main focus of the analysis, we might want to use secondary data, so take them, for instance, from a database. Okay. Well, then, of course, it's a good practice to validate our data, to check if material balances and energy balance is close, if everything is okay, and then we can trade those data. So we say that we have to decompose, to disassemble the production process into process units. So to build a personal computer, we will have many stages, from the extraction of raw materials to the production of intermediate subproducts and components up to the final assemblage of the final product. Okay, so we have to link all these process units in such a way that at the end we have the complete chain that goes from the final product back to the raw materials. Okay? This is an example of a flow diagram from the life cycle assessment of an alkaline fuel cell, just to show you that this is the representation that is used, for instance, in the softwares which are commonly used to perform life cycle assessment. Here you have basic products and you have material flows that go into the functional unit. And finally, the third phase is what we call the life cycle impact assessment. We should select specific impact categories we are interested to evaluate. Impact indicators that allow us to quantify the impacts in the different categories we have chosen. and what we call characterization models. We will see in a while what this means. Then we will have to take the life cycle inventory we have just built and assign the different material flows to different impact categories to quantify the impacts of every unit process. Okay, and then we will use this to characterize, so to calculate the impact indicators we are interested in. Well, there's quite a lot of impact assessment methods. They have been developed over the last 20 years at least, perhaps 30 now, and the choice of the impact assessment method depends on the purposes of the analysis, on the need to communicate them or to compare the results with previous analysis, etc. I go quite quickly through these slides because time is running fast, and well, you will have the opportunity to look more into details if you are interested in that. Let's say that the impact categories we can choose are quite a lot. These are some examples of commonly used impact categories. They go from climate change to impacts on the ozone layer, acidification, eutrophication, toxicity, both versus humans and the environment, etc. The choice of the impact categories is a critical point because it's very subjective. If we choose to focus on climate change impacts of carbon emissions or on the toxicity on humans and ecosystems, this might change the results of the assessment. For instance, the comparison between two products, because one product can be better from one viewpoint and worse from the other one. So, LCA studies are, of course, limited because they are a synthesis of the features of very complex systems. So we should always be aware that we are simplifying a complex system, so we are extracting a part of the information which is hidden in it. So we shouldn't claim to provide a comprehensive assessment of all environmental issues. It's a matter of choosing what we are interested in and saying it clearly. Another important point is whether we are interested in what we call midpoint impacts, which are basically emissions, how we alter the environment, and endpoint impacts, which are the final impacts on human health, on ecosystems, on resources. So we might be interested in simply quantifying how much carbon emissions a product generates, and so the global warming potential of that product, or we might want to assess the damages of that contribution to climate change on human health, for instance, or on human safety, or on ecosystems. You can easily understand that the second level of evaluation is much more difficult than the first one, because one thing is estimating how much carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by a production system. One thing is to evaluate how much this carbon dioxide will contribute to the global warming, and one different thing is to understand what will be the consequences of that climate change on human health and ecosystem health. So many times analysts decide to stop their analysis to midpoint impacts because the last level is much more difficult to achieve. Then we have to classify the material flows coming from the inventory into the different impact category. So, for instance, if we have emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, this can be ascribed to climate changing emissions, okay? CFCs, for instance, can be both classified as greenhouse gases and also as gases acting as impacting the ozone layer. So we can classify material flows of emissions of CFC in both impact categories. Or nitrogen oxides would contribute both to eutrophication issues and acidification issues. So we can have different flows having multiple impacts, both in parallel, because SO2 causes both soil acidification and toxic effects on humans, but also in series, because once the soil becomes more acid, it can mobilize heavy metals that are toxic to humans and ecosystems, so we have cascading effects. It's up to the analysts to find out all these impact cascades. And once we have classified all the materials flows found in the voluntary phase, we have to characterize them, which means translating them into an impact indicator, which is the same for all the material flows that fall within a class of impact. So, for instance, for climate change, we usually use carbon dioxide equivalents to transform into the same unit fluxes of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, etc. And so we can calculate what we call impact scores. So we can take fluxes from the inventory. So we will have different gases with different global warming potential, because you know, for instance, that one molecule of methane has a global warming potential which is 25 times that of a molecule of carbon dioxide, etc. So we will transform all of these fluxes into a carbon dioxide equivalent, and then we will sum them all up to calculate the total global warming potential of multiple emissions associated to a production phase. This is the European framework of impact classification. We have those categories which are used to quantify, to characterize midpoint impacts, so climate change, ozone depletion, human toxicity, ecotoxicity, etc. Okay? And then the endpoint impacts that are usually considered are three: impacts on human health, on ecosystems, and in general the natural environment, and the depletion of natural resources. Okay? So this is the European framework. Sometimes it will be possible to assess impacts in all these impact categories. Sometimes we will choose to focus only on some of them, depending on the resources we have available. Here, there's a few examples of one-dimensional impact indicators that are commonly used in life cycle assessments. For instance, the carbon footprint, so the greenhouse gas emissions associated to a product, or the water footprint, which has to do with the consumption of a natural resource such as water, or more complex indicators like the ecological footprint, which is, I guess you know, but it's the amount of biological productive land and water required to produce the resources we use and absorb the waste we generate. So these are examples of single-dimensional indicators, while there are indicators that try to take into account all the impact categories we have just mentioned, like the so-called eco-indicators are also very commonly used in life cycle assessment. One of the most recently proposed eco-indicators is what they call recipe, which has replaced a previously used, which was eco-indicator, and that takes into account different midpoint impact categories, and then comes up to the quantification of endpoint impacts, at least for the with the purpose to transform into comparable units the different types of midpoint impacts. These are examples of how endpoint impacts are calculated. For instance, impacts on human health are usually assessed in terms of daily disability adjusted life years. So how many years of life we expect to decrease our life expectancy due to the emissions into the atmosphere, soil and water of pollutants and so on. The fact that we use one or multidimensional indicators give us different perspectives, different viewpoints, because I said a product can be better than another one in terms of one impact category, but it might be worse from another viewpoint. So having a broad spectrum of impact indicators can allow us to identify trade-offs, because sometimes one choice is better in one direction, another choice is much better in another completely different direction. So perhaps there are some products that are in between, a good compromise between different options. Okay, let me, oh, it's quite late. 5 minutes, okay. I try to do it. Just a quick example of how we can apply life cycle assessment to the evaluation of a product. This is a case of a t-shirt. It's a very simplified life cycle assessment, but just to make it a bit more concrete, let's take as a functional unit a t-shirt, and for simplicity, let's take one man t-shirt, gray color, and a large size, which is produced with cotton and few other materials for the label and smaller parts. The weight is 180 grams, and this is a functional unit. So the measure of the function of the system we want to assess. Our reference for the analysis, we have to set system boundaries. This is very simplified, the life cycle of a cotton t-shirt, from cotton cultivation to the spinning and weaving of the cotton, the production of the t-shirt, and then we have the use and end of life of the t-shirt. And let's say that we focus only on the first stages, the production stages. So this would be what we call a cradle to gate assessment, not up to the end of life of the product, because the impacts during the use and end of life phase depends on how many times you wash your t-shirt before getting rid of it, how you would reuse or recycle the cotton after the end of life, etc. So many industrial life cycle assessment adopt this kind of approach, these system boundaries. Then we will have, for instance, primary use of primary data for the life cycle inventory only for the final phase of the production of the t-shirt, because we know the specific production system. We are able to interview the firm that produces the t-shirts, while secondary data will be used for the first phases, because, for instance, the providers of raw materials can change from time to time, so we take average database data for these phases. And this is a possible output of a life cycle inventory phase. So for each phase of the cycle, we have input and output flows, so raw materials, electricity, pesticides, fertilizers, water, and input, and N2O and CO2 emission and wastewater emissions as output from each phase. Then we come to the impact assessment, and let's say that, for instance, we decide to focus on carbon footprint. So we want to assess the carbon emissions associated to the production of the T-shirt. The impact indicator is therefore carbon footprint expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and the characterization model is the so-called GWP 100, so the global warming potential over a horizon of 100 years. So we have to classify all the emissions, all the output flows into the climate change impact category. So here in red we have highlighted those flows which are accounted for in a carbon footprint assessment. And so basically CO2 and N2O, they have different characterization factors because 1 kilogram of CO2 is equivalent to 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent, while 1 kilogram of N2O has a global warming potential which is about 300 times that of a kilogram of CO2. Okay, and then here we are finally to the last slide. We have the final output of the life cycle impact assessment. We have those material flows, greenhouse emissions from the production of this T-shirt, and we can multiply these emissions times the characterization factors, so these numbers here, to obtain the final result, which is our carbon footprint for our T-shirt. In this case, it's 2.7 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Okay, so producing a T-shirt like this one has an environmental impact in terms of global warming potential of almost 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Okay, I'm done. I hope it was not too quick, this review of how to assess the impacts of production systems. Thank you very much for listening. And, if you have questions or doubts, I think there's perhaps a question and answer session later, or they can. Okay. Any question? Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you for the talk, very interesting. How much is time considered a resource that is either invested or wasted during life cycle assessment?
You mean time as a resource?
Yes.
Well, I would...
It's the only resource that is not renewable. You cannot play it back. It plays a role in what we do. Is it ever considered? Maybe you said it, I missed it, but...
No, I didn't say it, and I think it's a very nice and provocative question. I would say that basically standard life cycle assessment focuses only on environmental impacts. Okay, so it's called the life cycle assessment, but it's now being called the environmental life cycle assessment because actually other life cycle assessments have been developed, such as life cycle costing, focusing on the economic component, and social life cycle assessment, which takes into account the social consequences of production systems. So I'm not sure, because I'm not an expert of social life cycle assessment, whether time, as you
No, I was thinking
mentioned it?
more in terms of environmental. On your
Yeah.
slide between the prehistoric human
Yeah.
and modern human, I was looking at the amount of solid waste and stock. Solid waste and stock, they have a decomposition time, they have a turnover time, they have an expiration time for the stocks.
Oh,
so
sorry.
inherently, there is time involved in how long it's going to take for, I don't know, biodegradable plastic to be destroyed and go back to the original bioinorganic compound with respect to original plastic. So I was wondering if you also consider a time component.
Okay,
of
no.
things to be
So
destroyed and
I
recycled.
misinterpreted your.
There's also the social aspect
Okay,
of not
okay,
being able to
your
recover it,
question.
but there's also a very practical
Well,
one.
so also in this case, I would say that traditional life cycle assessment has a static, in terms of time, approach, but there are relatively new developments that try to develop dynamic life cycle assessment. So a study of the system as a dynamical system, and so time dynamics would also be taken into account. Of course, this is very, very true because I don't know, for the balance of just of climate change and carbon emissions, time matters quite a lot, because if we stock it for 1 century of 1,000 years or just for 2 seconds, it's very different. Yes, that's why. Yes, in some sense, time is taken into account, for instance, in global warming potential, because we have different time horizons over which GWP can be assessed. The standard one is usually one century, for instance, to compare the different global warming potentials of different compounds. We look at the GWP over 1 century. So the comparison between 1 kilogram of CO2 and 1 of N2O is based on the contribution to global warming over a time horizon of a century. But for sure, time can be taken more explicitly into account in dynamical descriptions of the system. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. A quick question, and maybe it's off topic. Within the metabolic analysis, network analysis, do you consider, or would be useful to consider, exergy?
Well,
if that will help society to be more sustainable?
Okay. I'm not an expert of exegetic analysis, but I know that it has also been used in LCA as an indicator. So the exergy approach, well, I would say it's quite difficult sometimes to apply in practice, and that's probably why it has not been so widespreadly used in the history of life cycle assessment, but there have been attempts to use it, yes.
Other questions, comments?
Okay.
No, I have one question.
Oh,
Sorry, the
please,
last one.
please.
No, I have a question about the scale of application of RCA and the impact assessment and environmental impact as well. So should be used for at the level of the single factor of plant, or should be used also, or can be used also for comparing industrial scenarios?
Mm-hmm. I would say that the most common use is to assess products. So to compare to light bulbs, for instance. But it has been used as a broader scale, such as the assessment of plans and programs. So you might extend it also to the assessment of large industrial systems, for instance. Basically, perhaps when I talked about material flow analysis, which is maybe the mother of life cycle assessment, it's still being used global scales. So perhaps, I mean, the approach is basically the same, but the tradition of case studies is perhaps a little different between the two fields. And materials flow analysis has been commonly and widely used at the global level, for instance. But I mean, it's just a tool. You can use it at the level you want, and it simply becomes a matter of how difficult it is to find data. But of course, if you broaden the scale, you will less concerned on small errors and small data. You will be more interested in in broad pictures.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
So, I think you can move on. Okay, changes the name. Okay, so thank you very much. So we can move to the second speaker before of the coffee break. And I'm pleased to introduce Ioannis Varoufakis. He's a professor of ecology at the Open University of Cyprus and visiting professor here at the University of Milano Bicocca. The title of his talk is Ecosystem Services, a New Path Towards Sustainability? Question mark? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, you can hear me well. First of all, it's great to be here. It's the first workshop, conventional workshop, after 2 years of COVID in and out. So this is a great opportunity for us to meet again, and hopefully things are going to get better as we go along. Before I start, two things. First of all, I would like to thank the Department of Earth and Environmental and Earth Sciences at the University of Bicocca, which is hosting me for this sabbatical leave from my university. And in particular, I would like to thank my colleague, Emilio Padoskiopa, and the members of his lab, Claudia Canedoli and Noemi Rota, for being very accommodating, very hospitable with me during this period. The second thing I would like to say before I start is a kind of disclaimer. This is not a conventional presentation in the sense you will not see equations, you will not see huge data sets, you will not see, in other words, examples from my own research. What is this actually is a taster for a PhD course that's coming up. I think we're starting on the 29th of November here at Bicocca on ecosystem services with Professor Emilio Padoskiopa. And then there are some personal reflections, if you want, since I've been working with ecosystem services on and off since 2004-05, if I go well. So let's move on to the presentation itself. I started by trying to address two main questions. And then by listening to colleagues yesterday on a very interesting day during the presentations, I kind of thought I might as well try a third question, which took me very late into the night after dinner last night. In any case, the questions I will try to address in this presentation whether the ecosystem services approach is really new, whether it's going towards the right direction, and by the right direction, I'm implying here the link to, or the links, plural, to sustainability. And third, are we collectively going towards the right direction and out of the Anthropocene tunnel? So the outline, I will start with a couple of definitions, going to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals and CBD. The history, of ecosystem services. I will try to address the link between ecosystem services and sustainability goals. I will stop for a while and look at the link between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, which will take me to a big jump here, a big leap to ES and economics, and some hopefully new ideas. So let's start with two definitions. Probably you've seen both of those definitions before. The most commonly used definition by the UN World Commission on Environment and Development about sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I will come back to this definition at somewhere at the end of my presentation. The second definition, probably new to some of you, maybe not, is ecosystem services. Again, there are many ways you will find in the literature on the definition of ecosystem services. The one by Burkhardt and Myers is contributions of ecosystem structure and function in combination with other inputs to human well-being. You probably notice that human well-being is common in these two definitions, explicitly stated in the second, implied in the first. I'm pretty sure you're also familiar with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, and responsible consumption and production. You will immediately recognize that these goals are actually interlinked. And what you will probably also recognize by a closer look at these goals is that some of them are actually contradictory. How you reconcile economic development with nature conservation and protection. As the English would say, the old chestnut. Allow me to give a bit of background on the history of ecosystem services. The term, coined in the early 80s by various publications, and Robert Costanza, an environmental economist, a US environmental economist in 1997, with colleagues of course, tried for the first time to provide an estimate of the ecosystem services worldwide. By looking at 17, if I recall well, ecosystem services, they concluded that they provide an average of, or the value, an average of $33 trillion per year. This inspired a rapidly growing body of peer-reviewed interest, and scientific community started working actively on ecosystem services with major research undertakings. The most, and the first probably, that's why the most famous, is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, followed by the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. 40 years later, the concept of ecosystem services is moving from a heuristic model towards an explicit decision and policy tool. But also at the same time, we have controversy that has sparked on its utility and is rising constantly. We'll see in a while why. Is ecosystem services really new as a concept, despite the fact that it was coined back in the late 80s? Well, for an ecologist, biophysical structure produces a function or functions. We produce a service or services. Therefore, I would say that it's as old as ecology. Or, since ecology is a discipline developed by humans, it's as old as ecosystems' presence on this earth. In the late 60s and 70s, there were some publications addressing the notion of the usefulness of nature for society, based on ethical, mainly, concerns. My first degree is forestry. So one of the first things we learned at the university when it came to environmental economics, which, by the way, I hated as a material, was about non-timber forest products. So we were already talking in the 90s and before about food, substances, materials, and commodities that forests, other than timber, provide. And of course, forest is just an example. Recreation is a big player, if you want, in protected area management or forest management. And of course, ecological restoration was trying to do and address exactly that. What? Helping biophysical structures or restoring biophysical structures in order to produce functions and services. So I suppose the answer to the question is no. So what's new? What is new in the concept of ecosystem services? Well, in nature conservation terms, we're going for the first time from species, giving emphasis from species to the characteristics of ecosystem functions. The concept itself recognizes that we are dependent on health and function in ecosystems, and therefore our economic, social, and cultural needs depend on these ecosystems. Therefore, we have a shift from economic benefit to considering the whole concept of human well-being. And therefore, we move in from protection and de facto use of ecosystem services to ways in which we use these services and how their loss influence our well-being and how we can adapt in these changes in terms of the provision along a long time. This is one of the first diagrams of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, linking the main 4 categories at the time of ecosystem services clearly with well-being. 4 major groups of services: provisioning, like food, fresh water, wood and fiber; regulating, climate regulation, flood regulation, disease; cultural, aesthetic, spiritual, education, recreational, and supporting, things like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production. And since then, of course, you have various conceptual changes in this kind of models which link human well-being with ecosystem services. I prefer this one in the sense that it has placed biodiversity at its core. Biodiversity as supporting essentially the main pillar, supporting ecosystem services, which in turn support the socio-economic systems. In the literature, you'll find several graphs implying this relationship between biophysical structure, function, and service. These are just some examples. And this is probably the one that you will find more often in the literature, and it's behind, it's actually embedded into the Millennium, the mapping assessment of ecosystem services at the European level. A figure produced by Roy Hayes Young back in 2006. I've got this kind of graph has a bit of a sentimental value for me, in the sense that I was actually a member of the team back in 2005 in a couple of the first projects as a young researcher at the time, in a couple of the first research projects funded by DEFRA, which is the ministry essentially for environment and agriculture, looking into aspects of environmental services. Working with Roy Hayes Young, with David Raffaelli, Jeff Griffiths in the UK back in 2005. So, although I would agree with Robert Costanza that this kind of cascade model implies linearity, and we know very well that this is not the case in nature. To the defense of Roy and the team back in 2005-06, I would say that this was a simplistic way to start working on interlinked concepts. And of course, Robert Costanza later on proposed this kind of model, the capitals approach, suggesting an interaction between the main non-natural capitals, if you want, built, social, human, with natural capitals, affecting as a whole human well-being. Ecosystem services are seen as the relative contribution of natural capital to human well-being. So, although visualization of the concept has changed, okay, the essence of it hasn't. It's still about human well-being. And if you like complicated diagrams, I'll give you one more complicated diagram, colorful as well, which places again the natural capital with a distinct link, with the main ecosystem services categories, and how they're linked with built human and social capital. Always having in mind the far end of the graph, i.e. the human well-being. In the past 20 years or so, we've seen also the development of various ecosystem services classifications. I'm not going to go into classifications. There are plenty of classifications around, and the European Union has adopted recently this common international classification of ecosystem services, and they sort of decided to incorporate the old category, by now it's old, of supporting services into regulating or provisioning. So right now, what we're talking about is provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services, compared to the MICE original classification. Some of the early criticism of the ecosystem services approach is that it's too anthropocentric. It's a utilitarian view of nature, some would say. And I suppose, again, this goes to the other question that we usually address when it comes to nature resource management. Are we just one more species, or are we the dominant species? Because if we are the dominant species, then strictly speaking, we can do whatever we want, or not. Hold this thought. Naturally, within the EU's biodiversity strategies, more than one, but I'll stick to the 2021, ecosystem services were incorporated once they kind of came out in scientific literature and were gradually adopted by the scientific community. One of the aims, or the main aim, if you want, of the 2020 biodiversity strategy of the European Union was to halt biodiversity and ecosystem services loss within EU and globally. Ambition. Big plans. Particularly the second target refers explicitly to conservation and enhancement of ecosystems and the services which they provide. There are distinct actions that follow this target. Mapping and assessing the condition of ecosystems and the services at the national level, so essentially an obligation of all the member countries, member states, economic valuation of these services, and promoting the integration of the value in the accounting system at national and EU level. Wow, what is that? One of the international initiatives, the TEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, early enough addressed two main questions. What's the cost worldwide of the loss and degradation of ecosystems and biodiversity? And how do ecosystems and biodiversity contribute to addressing socioeconomic challenges and their adaptation to these? Ecologists, early enough, were complaining. We're complaining about the fact that nature is not really taken into account at the policy level. There's a long-term tradition of nature conservation in many countries, but it always has been about protected areas and what's happening in the protected areas. But there's more to it than protected areas, we know that. So we needed to find a way to talk to policymakers. We need to find a way to talk to economists. We don't do well with economists. We don't talk well. Ecologists and economists are strange bunches, both of them. So TEB came with this idea, obviously following Robert Costanza's work and the fact that gradually we were moving towards assessment and valuation once we define what ecosystem services are. And that report back in 2010 gave specific examples, made it very clear. Listen up, guys. Securing the coastal areas with the use of mangroves in Vietnam costs $1.5 or something million US dollars, when a dam would cost 7.3. It's cheaper. Cheaper is something that the economists and the policymakers understand very well. It's a good word. Okay. Your forests, protected areas which are around the New York City, are saving you $6 billion US dollars. And in Venezuela, your protected areas are saving you $3.5 billion because they reduce material transport and sedimentation. Plenty of examples like that. Mangroves, a favorite one. Reef ecosystems. Okay, this is, on average, the services they provide and their value. And we're talking about some of the most fragile ecosystems in the world, coral reefs, I mean. This is now found behind the concept that you will increasingly hear from now on, termed nature-based solutions. In other words, we try to mimic nature. We try to learn from nature. We try to use things that nature does for our own benefit. This is the European Commission definition: solutions that are inspired and supported by nature. Cost-effective, which provide environmental, social, and economic benefits and help build resilience. This is an excerpt taken from the recent EU Green Deal strategy. These are the economic and social costs of inaction. Do nothing, and you will simply lose. We have already lost that amount of money per year in ecosystem services from 1997 to 2011. We know that 75% of global food crop types rely on animal pollination. This is about, it starts becoming about food security in the long term. Pollination and bees protection right now is a huge sector, if you want, of a natural capital. There's a huge effort going on at least the European level to protect them. Why? Because of that. Because most of what we eat is actually pollinated by animals, well, a big chunk by bees. But naturally, as it's common in nature resource management, sometimes you lose, sometimes you win. You have to make tough decisions. There are trade-offs. Your benefit of a service might be my loss at the other end. And we have to decide the level of management in order to provide these services. Regulating services, think for example, climate regulation, are considered a public good, whereas usually provisioning services, food production, is attached with private use of land. And cultural services is a mixed bunch. Some are public, some are private. Some have local benefit, some others have got global benefit. And some, what Ted called the additional national benefit. How do you separate the lot? What's mine, what's yours? What's ours? And I'm getting to the nitty-gritty here. One of the reviews which looked into ecosystem services and how they're potentially linked to sustainability development goals found that 44 out of 169 focus directly on improving the environment and human well-being, 44 services. Using experts, they judged the individual ES make important contribution to 41 targets. More ecosystem services are thought to contribute to more than 3 targets, and 4 ecosystem services accounted for 46 of all perceived targets. Or if you prefer a graph, this is a graph. This is a graph of the major sustainability development goals. And this is essentially with colors from not assessed, which is the gray one, to uncertain, which is the light blue, and strong is the relationship that this study has found with the Sustainability Development Goals. And you will see that some are doing better than others. So a first answer to the question is this graph here. And then, although I had I wanted to do something else when I started the presentation, I kind of noticed the strong, apparently, relationship between some of the ecosystem services and poverty. The top left cells or targets, if you want, in your graph. Which is the first sustainability development goal? Okay, I said, ecosystem services and poverty. That's interesting. So I started looking at what's happening and how ecosystem services, if they can, alleviate poverty globally. So I came across this review paper, nicely written, which suggests that research has focused largely on provisioning services, with just two poverty dimensions: income and assets, and food security and nutrition. The study says that links between ecosystem services and dimension of poverty exist, but few provide sufficient context to enable a thorough understanding of the poverty impacts, positive or negative, if any. It goes by saying that, yes, perhaps it supports well-being and perhaps prevent people becoming poorer. This is where the fuzzy stuff starts. But there's no evidence of contribution to poverty alleviation, let alone poverty elimination. So we see that even in cases that there is a link, and as the previous study, and I'm taking you back, suggested, there's a strong link or level of support between the targets of the Sustainability Development Goals and ecosystem services. The truth is that there's no considerable evidence in practice. There's no substance. Yeah, it's obvious. I have more land, we'll produce more food. Yeah, but what does it mean globally? Already in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment has suggested that ecosystem services as a framework contribute to poverty alleviation. But one of the recent conferences pro-COVID that I went to, on the very topic of ecosystem services, had little info to suggest about the link between ES and poverty alleviation. Or, should I say, and rephrase that, my second bullet point, that usually we use ecosystem services and poverty alleviation when we talk about developing countries, which is an interesting bias, at least I find it interesting, as if in Europe or other continents, we don't have poor rural communities. And that to me came as a surprise. There's poverty in Europe as well. We know there's poverty in Europe as well. But somehow, ecosystem services is for the rest of the world, not for us European, when it comes to poverty alleviation. I think there's a gap here, and this is not my field of research, but certainly this is something that we have to explore, because in Europe we do have similar livelihoods, as we found in what we call the global south. We have small-scale farming activities, and we have areas of focusing on subsistence and not cash cropping. So, food for thought. And then, suddenly, in a recent workshop I attended, and I've pinched that slide, I was presented, or we were presented, with the challenge of our era and the solution. The challenge, rightly so, is that we're failing to address global challenges of nature loss, climate change, and raising inequality because our economic system fails to recognize the dependence on nature, people, and society. And what's the solution? Well, by 2030, every decade, notice we're shifting from 20 to 30, no, then we go to 40, 50, and so on. Apologies for being a bit pessimistic or cynic. By 2030, the majority of business, financial institutions, and governments will include the values of all capitals in the decision-making, and that this will deliver a fairer, just, and more sustainable world. In February 2021, the Dasgupta review came out on the economics of biodiversity, commissioned by the UK government. Essentially, the report is implemented by a large team of UK scientists. And one of the main sort of conclusions, if you want, is that we are still plundering the planet. Yes, we are. I agree. And this is why I highlighted as red. Due to outdated economics. Okay. Okay. Notice, and as I will go on, this will increase. Notice the change of semantics and the change of language. I've started, not because it's my own choice, but it's the literature, it's what's happening out there. I've started from nature. Gradually, I'm talking, and I'm not. I'm talking economics. Or, I'm talking what I understand about economics, based on what's happening around me at a social context, at the policy context, equally important, at the academic context. So, I also attended this very interesting workshop on ecosystem services valuation database, which is a new tool supported by the UNEP. Initially, it was a TEB database, FAO, and DEFRA, the UK Department of, or Ministry of Environment, if you want, the equivalent to us in Europe, where they give access to a number of studies with economic valuations. Naturally, when I see more terms introduced in economies, I will go and have a look at what economy or the models mean for ecosystem services for the firm who's actually suggested. Constanza called it a shift from the growth at all costs to a well-being economy. So far, so good. We're linking it back to well-being. That's one of the principles, or if you want, of the pillars of ecosystem services approach, how to support well-being. Anthropocentric? Yes, it is. Okay? Yes, it is. But whether we like it or not, we are the dominant species in the planet. Okay. I haven't seen anyone else around lately. Now, Dasgupta says that we have to change our measures of economic success to guide us on a more sustainable path, economic success. All right? But what about incommensurable values? Can we measure everything in nature? Can we measure spiritual values of nature for some? The October 2015 UN resolution states, transforming the world, the 2030 agenda, 2030, for sustainable development. SDG number 8, to sustain per capita economic growth at a rate of at least 7% gross domestic product per annum in the least developed countries. All right, okay. This is a term that goes down well with economists. They understood per capita growth. 7, I will push to 8, I will push to 10. 7 is a good number. Okay. In fact, this approach, and particularly the approach of environmental economics of the Dasgupta review, has sparked various criticisms. And these are coming not from ecologists. The criticisms are coming mainly from political ecologists. So suddenly, the issue has become political. Space and Hash in 2021, framing critical biodiversity loss as an issue of asset management and population size is a blind to avoid questioning economic growth, which remains unchallenged and depoliticized, despite apparently recognizing natural limits. Even more critical, Fletcher and Journal of Political Ecology, the interrelationship between social inequality and ecological destruction, it seems that can be explained only in two ways. It's either human population growth, which creates essentially resource scarcity, or, and this is your words, not mine, as a product of a capitalistic economic system demanding unsustainable resource use to facilitate economic growth that has little to do with satiating the needs of the human collective, but rather with enriching a select few at the expense of the rest. Wow. This is not mine. This is a political manifesto. It sounds like a political manifesto, but behind it is actually a clash of two words. Two worlds, as in Monty, two worlds that have different viewpoint about where we are heading or where we should be heading. And it's not just political ecologists. Looking at the literature, I found a recent paper by Wiedemann and colleagues. Actually, natural scientists warning on affluence. Okay, they're telling us, guys, the problem is our lifestyle globally, as well as the rest. Perhaps desperate times like those we live in require desperate measures. And I recommend both of these two books. Different approaches, but very interesting. The one by the famous biologist Edward Wilson, called Half Earth, A Planet's Fight for Life, which essentially presents what you would call a nature-culture dichotomy. To put it very plainly, Wilson suggests that it needs to, well, if we want to get out of the Anthropocene tunnel safe and sane, we need to protect 50% of our earth and oceans, or land and oceans, if you prefer. On the other side, we have this book, The Conservation Revolution, by political ecologist Bishop from the, if I remember well, Netherlands University, don't remember the university, doesn't matter, Bishop and Fletcher, who suggest something else, what they call convivial conservation. And I will tell you, I will summarize the main points of convivial conservation in a while. So they say that as opposed to industrialism, convivialism has 5 elements. We need to move away, they say, from strictly protected areas to promoted areas, a more encompassing term perhaps. From saving nature to celebrating human and non-human nature. From touristic voyeurism to engaged visitation. From spectacular to everyday environmentalism, and from privatized expert technocracy to common democratic engagement. A whole new perspective here. Is this another way of bringing nature back into our lives? Perhaps it is. When I left the UK in 2010, this report had come out at the time. The Lawton Review, Making Space for Nature, using very simple terms for me ecologists to understand, but also for the layman, for everyone to understand. Lawton and his colleagues said at the time, ladies and gentlemen, what we need is improving the existing ecological network of an area. More, better, bigger, and linked, joined up. These were the 4 words. This was the essence of this report. The more we do to improve the quality of existing sites or to reduce the pressures on them by enhancing the wider environment, the less we will need to do to create new wildlife sites. Proactively, not retrospectively. And these are based on the philosophy of landscape ecology as presented by its founder, Richard Foreman, back in the early 90s. And this is something I can relate to. And this is the European Green Deal. Bringing nature back into our lives. Back one, making space for nature, bringing nature back into our lives. Similar, perhaps? In red, financial, economic terms. In green, nature conservation protection terms. If I was given this text without the title on top, then I would say, oh, this is written by an economist. One of the efforts with the Green Deal, and it's most welcome actually, is the European Commission's ambition on ecosystem restoration and nature-based solutions. Fair enough. But hang on a second. Before we start digging, can we look around and see whether there are areas which already have and we can use to meet our targets? And talking as an economist, guys, it will also save us money. We don't have to start digging. The answer is yes, there are. This is the approximate distribution of high nature value farmlands in Europe. These are sites which are based on traditional agricultural practices, low impact agricultural practices, and at the same time, they support important populations of birds, butterflies, and insects. This is a good target. And if you can see, particularly the eastern side of Europe is full of them. But also, Greece has a lot, France as well. And look at Sardinia and Corsica. Do we have anything else? Yes, we do. What's that? These are roadless areas, the worldwide map produced by Epoch and colleagues in 2016 in Science, which shows areas which are far away, 1 kilometer far away from roads. Roads is another major issue, which an insidious, as I call it, agent of biodiversity loss, sorry. And there are quite a few areas globally that we can focus on. And of course, the new CAP reform. The green architecture of the CAP reform is a good start, if only it had slightly ambitious targets. Otherwise, what we're doing is it's push and pull, as they call it in English. Okay, we're going one step forwards, 2 steps back. This is not giving clear messages. And of course, biodiversity and other policies at the EU level has always had conflicts and will have conflicts. So, because I need to wrap up, this is a diagram by Schroeter and colleagues. We need to refocus ecosystem services towards sustainability. This is one of the diagrams which actually shows how ecosystem services can be incorporated to sustainability strategies and outcomes. This is a very interesting paper. And we should be looking at ecosystem services essentially as a boundary object, as an object essentially that is at the center of sustainability, but also about at the center of management decisions. Third question, are we in the right path? I will answer it as fast as I can. COP26, it was over last week in Glasgow, UK in partnership with Italy. Pledges. Nations have promised to end deforestation, curb methane emissions, and stop public investment in coal power. So, big question. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? And is the Honorable Minister of Tuvalu wet or dry? Both questions are irrelevant, or both questions are rhetoric. We know the answer. We need to fill up the glass and we need to get the minister dry. Dobbiamo riempire il bicchiere e far asciugare il ministro. These are the answers. Deadlines are there to be missed, or the devil is in the detail. Even if we accept good intentions from all sides involved, government, policymakers, industry, how and by when is sometimes more important than what. And our track record is negative. Failure to meet the EU biodiversity targets by 2020. So what? We're shifting it for 2030. The recent CAP failed, the previous one, to halve biodiversity loss in its farmlands. And we failed to meet the 2009 pledge to provide 100 billion annually in climate finance for low and middle income countries. Are we trustworthy? I'll let you give that answer, not myself. However, it's not all about government, policymakers, and the industry. Our individual responsibility kicks in. You can do your own maths. There's this very nice footprint calculator. A colleague before was talking about ecological footprint, and this is one of the calculators in the web. I suggest you do the math. I'm too embarrassed to reveal my result, because unfortunately I'm close to the global average. And there's another quiz by the IUCN. What ecosystem are you? It asks you about your personal characteristics as an individual, and then it gives you an outcome of what sort of ecosystems you fit in. And I'm a deciduous temperate forest. We are already on a compromised trajectory. This is the definition I showed you in the beginning of the sustainability. And essentially, what we're doing right now is compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Yul Wilson put it differently, and he said that future scientists will write about the Anthropocene, that it combined the technological progress with the worst of the human nature. What a terrible moment for humans and the rest of life on the planet. But come on, guys, we've done it before. Human history is full of colonization attempts. We can do it again in the near future. I will finish on some thoughts on Earth's evolution. I stole this line from Donatello's presentation. Earth's evolution, a function of life and cognition. And I stole from the title of Emilio Pardaskop on Environmental Surprises. And I've created the Giovanelli Pardaskop model, okay, on Earth's evolution. A function of life and cognition plus a stochastic factor, as all models have. Environmental surprises. Anthropocene, anthropokeno in Greek. Well, a bit of Greek, I'm Greek after all, I have to say something in Greek. Otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. Keno in Greek means new. So all the eras, geological eras, Anthropocene, Holocene, is holo and new, anthro and new. But also written in a different way, keno, you can see the difference here between, this is the two e we have in Greek, e and I, also means empty. So whether Anthropocene is going to be a new epoch where humans dominate, or an epoch empty of rational humans, we will not live to tell the tale. I like this planet, and I'm afraid that we don't have a planet B. Thank you.
Yannis, thank you very much for your intense talk. So we are a bit late, but I think that it was worth doing it. And if there is any question or comment, and then you can afterwards engage Yannis and Paco.
So thank you very much, Ioannis, for this inspiring talk. Mine is probably more a comment than a true question. I completely agree with you with most of... Sorry. Yeah. So I basically completely agree with your view and the clash, the still ongoing clash between economics and ecology. So I think there's, in the last century, we have accumulated so much evidence, scientific evidence. We're still struggling to find a way to convince economists that we have to change the way, but I think that the situation of the past 2 years of COVID has more and more exacerbated this point, because we see that most comments on newspaper we still have we have Green New Deal to go through, but GDP must restart growing. So if we don't solve this point, I think that economic growth is not a must. Oh, it's a must to find an alternative to that. But of course, it's difficult to see a way which is not dramatic for a transition to a different economic system.
This is what literature reports globally. I mean, we've been trying for ages to do just that, to reconcile our own needs with the needs of the other species on the planet. I'm not an economist. I mean, you heard me. I have probably, I don't know, you can call it a biased view, or you can call it an uninformed view. I'm not an economist, full stop. I've just noticed this shift in semantics, this shift in terminology in the last 10 years. And this has come into once ecosystem services came into place. And so you ask me, so was it a good thing or was it a bad thing? Yeah, it was a good thing. I mean, it's great that we can show around people in society what ecosystems can do for them. Okay, but this sudden push towards economic valuation is something that worries me. The fact that we're actually pushing increasingly towards that direction, and we think that this is the answer to the problem, I don't know. I'm not convinced yet. I'm not convinced.
Other questions, comments? So otherwise we can move to the coffee break. Thank you very much to both the speakers. And so we are a little bit late. If we can shrink a little bit the coffee break to 20 minutes, okay? So 11:20 we start again with the second part of the morning session. Thank you.
Okay, so we are ready to start with the last presentation given by Eiko Lange and Francesca Malfatti. So the first one is Eiko. Eiko is a professor of organic chemistry at the university, in our University of Milano Bicocca, at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. His work on, of course, organic chemistry applied to sustainability. And the title of his presentation is How to Turn Chemistry Sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it's actually inorganic chemistry, but I mean, I'm general and inorganic chemistry. I heavily rely on the fact general, to be honest, because I do not really care practically whether it's inorganic or organic. As you will see why. So thanks for the opportunity to present. It's a little bit, I will talk about something that is a prerequisite for what I'm normally doing. So I'm normally working with one of the materials that are produced during a biorefinery process. In this presentation, in the context of the whole workshop, I will introduce the concepts of biorefinery and what they are good for, and then what comes out of it. All in the aspect of turning chemistry sustainable, not only green. Green chemistry is maybe something you've already heard, right? That comes up once in a while. Sustainable chemistry is not necessarily green chemistry, as you will see. okay? And given the pressing needs of our times, we need to put to sustainable, not only to green. So, echo. So, chemistry and sustainability. The whole issue is born practically that we need a sustainable society. And in a sustainable society, we need to use biomass. As much as we need to use solar energy, etc., we need as a resource for doing anything, we need to use biomass, right? If we want to get rid from oil, we need to use the biomass. So the biomass becomes key for producing food, materials, fuels, power, heat, and chemicals, obviously, right? And then, as you know, without chemicals, we're not doing much, because whatever we use in our daily life at the end of the day is a product of a chemical, or lots of the products are of chemical origin in the sense that someone took monomers, for example, and polymerized them, right? So the problem here is that we have also the food factor, right? So as soon as we use biomass, we start to have a competition between, do we use land for growing something that we eat, or do we use the land for growing something that we have to convert into a novel plastic, for example, right? Given that the surface is limited, this is a huge aspect of the whole problem. So obviously, the solution would be to produce something, a crop, for example. No, we eat a part of it, and the rest has to be used for something else. So that will be a challenge, though. Then chemical science have always had a leading role in the development of the modern society. It's one of the key sciences in order to have progress on a society level. However, these chemical sciences have to go together with bio-based economies. Bio-based economies has been termed a couple of years ago, already in 1997, when the problem started to emerge more visibly. And since then, however, we are struggling, to be honest, to get these bio-based economies working. And the point here is a little bit connected to the presentation you already heard, is the economy factor, right? As a red line across the talk, one of the red lines that you hopefully see across the presentation is that without having the economy on board and having an economically valid solution, it will not work. Because unfortunately, now we have economies, and we cannot get rid of the economic surrounding just to become green or sustainable. That will never work. So, how do we get that done then? Why do we focus on chemistry? Or why did I choose to agree to talk about chemistry sustainable? So this is obviously a cartoon, oversimplified, but it has, like all these things, a certain level of truth in it, right? So we can eventually define different scientific fields according to their, let's say, theoretical purity, right? And if you do that, you could say, so we have sociologists, and you could say from a psychologist's point of view that sociology is just applied psychology. The biologist would say that psychology is just applied biology. So the chemist, so I myself and other people that do chemistry might say that biology is nothing else but applied chemistry, right? Applied in the sense that we manipulate, or nature manipulates, chemical functions. The physicists would say that chemistry at the end of the day is based on thermodynamics, so it's applied chemistry. And then we have, far away from all the others, the mathematicians that press everything in concepts that should be generally valuable across the universe, right? Together with the theoretical physicists. And that's more or less the world in which we move. That's perfectly fine for moving on, theoretically. And then it comes to the chemistries to make it work. Let's see it like that, right? So at the basis is the chemistry. So we need to get the chemistry working, otherwise we get stuck right there. Obviously, for implementing sustainability concepts, green concepts, etc., we need, and that's obviously not a joke, we need psychology, we need sociology, we need economy science, right? And we need to learn to think, like this workshop, to think in a more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary version. I mean, every one of us is fine on its own right, but we need to think as a global science community in order to make it work, to be honest, because there's no time that we wait that it diffuses slowly as it did in the past, right? We need to actively work on the diffusion and on the mindset. So, as I said, in order to talk about biomasses that are used for chemicals, etc., we need to do a biorefining. You all know that oil, as it comes from the reservoirs across the world, is basically a huge mixture of something, a black viscous liquid. In order to get it done, to get it valorized in form of fuels for the car, fuels for the airplane, monomers for the chemical industry as starting materials, it has to undergo a refinery process, right? Those are the huge steam crackers that you see in the oil-producing countries where you have the flame on top, etc., right? So the crude oil has to be refined. And the same is true for biomass. There's no way that you use a tree as it comes, obviously, right? A tree as it comes is only good for burning it, for getting some heat. But if you want to use it in a much better way, we might have to fractionate it, use a fraction of it also for burning it, for heat production, but other parts of it, maybe for producing novel chemicals, novel polymers, etc. So we need to do a biorefining. This biorefining, obviously, whatever I said so far, has been noticed, obviously, also on the governance level. So the European Commission, as you know, is heavily pushing towards that direction, not only since the last change of Commission, but also the Commission before had the same idea. In 2012, there was this important move that they launched programs to have the bioeconomy for Europe. That was basically an onset. Because in this framework, in this time frame, was also the Horizon FP7 program that just finished in 2020. Now we have the Horizon 2020. No? In this framework, FP7 was driven heavily towards basic research to get ideas. How could you do a biorefinery? How could you do biologically degradable plastics, etc., for example, in the chemistry field. The New Horizon framework, the New Horizon 2020 framework, is meant to bring it to application. Okay? So the Commission had the idea, this was very correct as such, to screen basically for technologies, make people think of what technologies could exist, how could I make it work, and now, however, we have to sort out a little bit the technologies that are from an academic level very, very nice, but from a practical level, not so nice, right? So in Horizon 2020, we have to push to get it, basically to get a technology to market level. We need to get it to market level because I said, if you don't take on board the economy, you can forget about your sustainable approaches. They remain a publication, they remain a patent, they remain an award, but they will never see the real life application. And that's not the way to go anymore, right? So, the new thing is the European Green Deal that we heard already. And here, obviously, are a lot of initiatives that try to foster these findings, to get the biomass enter the market in various forms. This is an iconic picture of the Green Deal going local. And here we have some aspects that we need to think about. If we want to use biomass, obviously we need to use the biomass, as I said, without destroying our cultural landscape, right? It's no way that we get rid of all the forests just because we need the wood of the trees. So we need to preserve Europe's natural capital while using the biomass. So we have a huge constraint in the use of the biomass. We need to have a circular economy because also biomass is renewable, but it takes years for a tree to grow. Right? It's not that it grows, if you don't go for annual plants like crops, etc., but if we need a spruce, for example, or an oak tree for the quality of its material, not only as a building material in terms of the wood itself, but as the wood as a source of biopolymers, as we heard yesterday in one of the presentations. So we need to think of that. A circular economy, because we have to reuse, obviously, eventually the materials much more than we do at the moment. Everything with zero pollution, obviously, so whatever you do in biorefinery, no pollution. From farm to fork means, obviously, short waste, etc., and so on, right? We could talk 1 hour just about the constraints these little phrases put to whatever you want to do on a research level and to the implementation of biomass. Then, let's have a look at some numbers. Let's talk about renewable energies, because if I want to do chemistry, I need energy, right? A chemical reaction is nothing else as a transformation of bonds, for example, between molecules. These bonds, however, are eventually stable, otherwise the molecule wouldn't exist. So in order to break a bond, to create a new bond, to make me a new material, I need energy to put into the system, right? To get the reaction running, for example, in a very simple wording. So we need to think in the sense of sustainable chemistry also about methods that would allow us to combine a sustainable chemistry, a green chemistry, whatever that might be, to sustainable energy generation, right? And a sustainable energy generation would be relying on solar energy or on wind energy. And those two energies have two major difficulties. Solar energy is available, let's say, 12 hours a day, and then there's no sun, no energy. If I have a chemical plant that is constantly running to produce me a monomer for a polymerization, right? Those plants don't run only from 8 to 8. They run 24/7. Otherwise, it's economically not viable. How do I run a plant if I have energy for half of the day? Same is for wind, right? I cannot shut down my plant just because it's a nice day in summer without wind. So from a chemical industry perspective, this is a major challenge. Because what I need is a huge battery that preserves me the energy during the day that I didn't need for my reactor to run the reactor during the night. So a topic that I cannot talk about in the time we have is it's not only the use of renewable energies, but their storage. Which brings us again back to a chemical field, because for creating batteries, obviously, right? Batteries are electrochemical reactions, galvanic cells locally separated, which I can connect when I need them. That's a battery, right? So I make an electrochemical reaction work once I need it. That's a battery. However, I mean, our normal batteries, the lithium accus that we all use in the smartphones are not okay for that. The capacity and the way it is made, it's not for this. You could never run a plant, an industrial plant with such batteries. So we need completely different type of batteries, and that's a very active research field in inorganic and general chemistry, because we need new electrolytes, we need new concepts of a battery, right? We need huge batteries. It's not even a battery that you have in the cars eventually, in the modern cars. They are really small compared to the batteries you would need to run a industrial plant on this energy, right, if you don't store it. But as I said, that's a whole other lecture of several hours. So we skip that, but you keep it in mind as a basic problem, please. So let's talk about global warming. That we will talk about very, very quickly, because I think you know all that. So we have the problem with the CO2. We have the problem with the global warming. We have the carbon cycles that are natural, but we are overriding basically nature's capacity to absorb again the CO2. That's the main problem. So we had a system that was nice in equilibrium, and now we have the chemical principle of Chatelier. So we push the equilibrium to one side, and the system is basically at the moment not able to react. The system will react, obviously, right? If you think of a chemical system, it will react. So this chemical equilibrium for the CO2 will eventually react, and all the systems on Earth will re-stabilize on a different type of equilibrium. So our planet doesn't care whether it gets warmer or not, right? It did that in the past. And then it went colder again, etc. Our problem with the global warming, our only problem with the global warming, is that our existence will change eventually too drastically as that we can't exist anymore, right? That's the problem of the global warming. Earth doesn't care. It did that global warming, cooling, global, etc. millions of times in the past. We have the problem. We, as humans, have a problem with that, right? So we created our major problem at the moment. So, as I said, you know all these curves by now, I hope, right? This is CO2, this is methane. Methane is worse than CO2 because it's much more potent as a greenhouse gas. Methane, unfortunately, is chemically, obviously, also very, very interesting and important. Then, this is a cartoon I found yesterday in a German newspaper. I'm German, so I read German newspapers in the evenings. I found this cartoon. I think I don't have to translate, right? To see here, COP62 in 2057. We are not there anymore because we didn't make it. And what they actually say, they look at the skull and say, no, they must have been really intelligent. Unfortunately, we are reasonably intelligent, I would say, to solve the problem. The problem is that we do not have very much time to do so, right? And the time factor becomes important, unfortunately. So let's see what we can do in Biobase. Before we enter, just another aspect. Apart from saving the planet and us, essentially, not the planet, us in saving us, there's another aspect to green and sustainable chemistry that is much more, let's say, acute. That would be, as you all know, especially here, no, around Milano, you know that there was in '76 the bad accident in Seveso. That accident was a chemical accident that liberated a toxic substance, and that toxic substance, even if we are below the legal levels, it's still detectable in the ground, right? Because the substance that was liberated is a chemical compound that is not degradable. So it will be there, it gets diluted over the years, right? But it will not go away until the crust of the earth starts burning because the sun is exploding. So at the end of days, in absolute sense. We had the very bad accident in Bhopal in India. So this has a long-term effect, right? In Bhopal, it was an immediate effect because the substance that got liberated was acute toxic. So here people died immediately, right? Whereas here we're still waiting because the time since '76, it's now more or less 40 years that we still need to wait more time to see whether there are long-term effects. Then we had last year, no, I guess that is something you all remember. There was this huge explosion in the harbor of Beirut in Lebanon because this is a copy-paste error because I wanted to write here that it was ammonium nitrate that exploded. Right? Ammonium nitrate is a chemical substance that is important for fertilizers, for example, right? For the production of fertilizers. So apart from being sustainable, obviously storing huge quantities is another big issue. And so maybe we have to rethinking anyway of a redoing of chemistry on an industrial level. We might also think of producing the amounts we need right on the spot, right? Instead of storing millions of tons in a warehouse without any protection in a way that destroys basically an entire city and economy of a country, right? Because since that the Lebanon is basically doing very badly. So if I want to do something green or sustainable, I need to find a way to measure it. So there was something like the E factor introduced a couple of years ago. And the E factor basically tells me the amount of unit wastes produced per unit product. And if you look at the table, you see this number here. So if we do oil refining, we have a very, very low E factor. So what does it mean? It means, in other words, that the oil refinement process, as it is run now, is not only economically very viable, but it has been optimized to the maximum, right? Whatever I could optimize in order to get most out of my liter of crude oil has been done. There's not a single milliliter, basically, that is wasted, okay? And that's the biggest problem, because it's so efficient, the process. It has been created so efficiently in order to make money, right? And our problem with all this, as I said, with this cartoon is we might be intelligent enough to optimize these processes, but as soon as it comes to something like earning money, right? Getting something easy instead of something complicated, getting something quickly instead of waiting for a while, some very primitive mechanisms take over, and we just do the quick thing. We do the cheap thing. We do the convenient thing, right? Without thinking of long-term aspects of it. And that's that's another aspect we could discuss about is our way of seeing time. Because there are now some philosophers start to think that one of our major problems that brings us all these secondary problems is that we have a very wrong perception of time eventually, right? We have very limited time horizons. We cannot imagine the world in 100 years. It's just not possible. We can see back, but in terms of realizing problems that emerge, we are very bad. That's an effect of our evolution. We cannot do much, but at least we could be more aware that we have this defect in order to account for it. So let's go a little bit more quickly. So we have to introduce green chemistry, and green chemistry has been a huge thing. 10 years ago, there have been these 12 principles of green chemistry, and everyone that wants to do chemistry in those days had to do something that adhered at least to one of them in order to publish, for example, right? So prevent waste and design safer chemicals and products, design less hazardous chemical synthesis, use renewable feedstock chemicals, and so on, right? Maximize atom economy, that means don't produce waste. It's another way of saying don't produce too much waste, energy efficiency, and minimize accidents, for example, right? Let's focus on this aspect that is difficult enough. So this would be green chemistry. So I take a tree as a starting point, and I'm automatically green, right? That might work. But the question is, am I automatically sustainable? Is using water instead of is using 10 liters of water instead of 1 liter of an organic solvent that I can eventually recycle really green? Is it greener than using 1 liter of organic substance instead of polluting 10 liters of water? Is that green? Is that sustainable? So that is where the problem starts, right? At the early days, when a concept emerges newly, obviously it's easy to say, oh yeah, no, this is black, this is white. But then the more you do, the more shadows you see on emerging in all this nice early days of new concepts. Then you start thinking of the fact that maybe the story is not just black and white. And maybe we come to a point where we have to, for every single process, have to decide, do I want to be green? Do I want to be sustainable? Or what do I have to change? All these parameters that I could change, what do I have to change in order to be green and sustainable to the maximum? So I have to find a compromise for every single process, and especially in chemistry, for every single chemical reaction that gives me a product that I can use or that I want to use for the daily life, right? So that's a huge amount of processes to revisit, basically. And if I want to revisit these processes, let's skip this, in order to get the transition from oil to forest-based chemistries or biomass-based chemistries, I have to think that exists at the moment this way, very, very efficiently. I take oil, I refine it, and I get everything I need for moving on as a society. I need to have this, right? But obviously, if this has been made compatible over the last 60, 50 years of industrial research, industrial engineering, science in general, I cannot switch from one day to the other from using a tree for an existing chemical factory like this, right? This is an image of one of these chemical producing consortia. This is BASF in Germany, okay? And it doesn't take anything to understand that a company with thousands of employees, right, that sort of company will never abandon all these setups that they have, right? That would be, they would die as a company. It's impossible. So if they want to implement biomass as a starting point, they are interested. They know the problem, right? Also, those guys are not idiots, so they know that there's a pressing need to use biomass, but they would like or would need to use the biomass using their existing factories, at least for the major part, right? I cannot abandon all this quickly, construct something out of nothing newly at this level of productivity also. So in order to get the green transition, the Green Deal working, I need a green transition, but the green transition has to be aware of the boundary conditions, and boundary conditions in terms of chemistry is also existing chemical plants. If I want to be quick, I need to find a way to use the existing plants at least, the manufacturing ways. So I need to find a way to get the biomass to a point, an intersection point here, where whatever I produce from the biomass is similar to what I got so far from oil, okay? And that is the point where we enter in the discussion of platform, so-called platform chemicals. We will see that later again. I need platform chemicals, which would be the chemicals, the chemical structures. A couple of compounds is not even much, it's 25 at the max normally. 25 chemical substances that serve as a starting point for everything that is chemically produced in the chemical industry. So, the real problem is to find ways to take the biomass, transform it into a suitable starting material that can be readily used in existing chemical setups. That is the quickest way, okay? So, how do we do that? Let's think of biomass. Biomass, now we have trees, so biomass could be a tree, right? This is obviously an old tree. An old tree is not the same as a young tree from a chemical point of view, unfortunately, right? So the problem starts already here. Then, this is biomass, right? This is nice to see, to look at. This one is used, obviously, sunflower oil, etc., etc. But apart from that, this is biomass that I could use chemically for the chemical industries. This is biomass, right? That guy here is biomass, to be honest. This is biomass already harvested, right? This is a picture from Canada. This is a typical way they do it in Canada. So they cut the trees once they are ready. They put them on the rivers, and they let them, you see here is a ship, they let them run down the river until the factory, right? And then they collect them at the factory, so they save transport costs. But this is biomass production, obviously, on a huge level. This would be okay for a starting point for the chemical industries if I use a tree as a starting biomass. Obviously, doing that, I have to avoid to arrive at these scenarios here from this is 100, 120 years ago, this picture. One of you sees the human being in that picture. You must not think of a typical Italian forest or a European forest. Think of an American forest. So obviously someone cut the trees, right? A part of them. So where's the human being in that picture? You have to adjust your scales a little bit in order to find them. Or him. It's a him. It's a single person. You see him? Here. He's standing here. Okay? This is one of the guys that cut the trees. So obviously these trees are one of the mammoth trees in America. These famous trees that they took the timber from for constructing the houses, right? So probably nowadays this forest is not there anymore, right? Because obviously this was very short-sighted action. They used the wood for building houses, fine. Or parts of the wood for building houses. Obviously, in terms of quantity of biomass, it's immense, right? If this is a human being, a grown-up, and look at him and look at the trees, right? So that was one of the problems. So we lost already a lot of biomass that we could have used differently. This is another way of not using biomass. This is a very recent picture from this year. This is a picture of the Amazonas forest. So what is wrong with this picture? The Amazonas forest is here, and these are oil palm plantages. So this is biomass, which serves for a certain purpose, obviously, right? This is biomass. No? The palm oil is used for food ingredients, for other processes, right? This is obviously a biomass production, but it's a biomass production done very, very badly, right? This is a biomass production done in a quick way, economically very valuable way, but unfortunately it's not long-lasting. So it's bio, it's green, I use biomass, right? But it's not sustainable, because this area is forever gone. Because the palms that grow here for the palm oil have not the same capacity to retain the soil, etc., right? So I wash out all the nutrients into the sea, and then eventually also the debris of these palm trees. And then, as you heard in Luca Zoya's presentation yesterday, for 10,000 of years in the Amazonas, nothing changed. And now, in the last 100 years, we cut down this, we plant this. So if someone does this type of analysis in a couple of thousand years, they will find that abruptly, in around the our 2000s, there was a huge change in the composition of the biomass after 10,000 of years without any change. That is obviously something that is not so good. So, let's talk about land-based renewable materials a little bit more in detail. So, since old times, when the people were not so rushing after money and had more time, they used already flax, they used hemp, They used jutes or bast fibers, and we have cotton, obviously, right? So we have these materials that are used. We have bamboo fibers. In China, they use a lot of bamboo. And we have sisal fibers. They come from leaves. And we have other abaca. We have other leaf fibers here. So these are materials that have been used in the past. Problem with this is that it works on a small scale. It doesn't work on a large scale, right? And as soon as we need large scales, because as a population on the planet, we grew that drastically also over the last 100 years, this was fine, but it's not fine anymore. No, we couldn't, I mean, these techniques that were okay with nature, a little bit better with nature than our current ones, didn't satisfy the demand, right? So the primary mechanism scattered, I need it, I do not want to pay for it, so give me something else that doesn't cost. So, let's go back to our trees. So this is a picture you saw yesterday, more or less. So we have the composition of the trees, and we have as major parts cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Cellulose is paper. We need cellulose in order to create paper. Although we are digital in every way, the consumption of paper increases still every year. So the industries that produce cellulose are still doing very well, right? Then we have hemicellulose that has a lot of applications in various fields, and we have the lignin. And then this is one of the pictures, like you saw already yesterday, the together of these biomaterials. If we want to use the biomaterials and make platform chemicals out of them, I have to separate them, taking the tree. And that is where the biorefinery comes into play. So this, apart from these substances that we had, that I said, we have obviously in the tree also other substances that could be used as platform or as starting points for chemical productions. Some of them are within the extractives, for example, right? And then we have these famous ones, these terpenes. These ones are the ones that give you the nice scent that you experience when you go into a forest, right? In a huge forest, not in one that is close to the road. You do not smell anything useful there. If you go to a real forest, a pine forest, the stuff that this typical scent of a pine forest comes from these guys. They are in the trees, and I obviously could take them out in a biorefinery process to get my first useful chemical out of the tree. I have fats and waxes. I mean, the use of fats and waxes is clear, right? I have phenolic compounds, like stilbenes, lignans, tannins, and lignin, obviously. Lignin we talk later a little bit. As an extractive, we have tannins. Tannins are famous, right? If you drink green tea, you normally do better in a health perspective because green tea contains tannins. Tannins are antioxidants. They protect your organism from radicals, etc. If you drink wine, you have tannins in there. Obviously, in wine, you have the alcohol that has a little bit of contrary effect. Then we have, stilbenes, lignans have the same properties as such because they are phenols. Problem with tannins is that tannins are also perfect materials for being wood adhesives. So I could create a very sustainable green wood adhesive, right, that I need for constructing. But I can use the tannins that are inside the biomass only once. So I have to decide, do I want to use them for, do I want to take the tea, for example, extract the tannins? No one would do that, right? But that's an example it would work. Do I extract the tannins from the tea and use it for building, or do I leave the tea leaves for drinking tea? Right? So that is just a very simple example of illustrating the problem. So we might have this competition that the chemical substance is good for both, for us or for keeping us alive on long terms. And we have vegetable oils. Vegetable oils are important because I can eventually transfer them into biodiesel, right? So here, biodiesel, I guess you have heard, right? So it's a fuel for the cars based on vegetable oils. A couple of years ago, there was a huge discussion to use this biodiesel because the cars that we have, the engines, obviously have been optimized to have the minimum energy loss and to have the maximum that they take out of burning the fuels, right? This heavy optimization of this engineering in an engine is not compatible with using something like a biodiesel. The engine will suffer because it's optimized for something very pure. A fuel that you put in your engine normally nowadays is very, from a chemical perspective, as a substance, as a material, very, very high quality. A biodiesel coming from a natural source will never reach that purity unless I put so much energy and effort into it that I can also start from oil, okay? So, the problem here with the acceptance of biodiesel is that obviously if I have to choose from an economical point of view, do I buy a new car and ruin the engine in 5 years just because I take green fuel? Or do I take a new car, I take the old fuel and hope that the car lasts 8 years, right? So my economic sense takes over, I forget about the green fuel, I buy the car, I wanna make most of the money that I invested into the car, I forget about the biodiesel, also because this costs more than the normal fuel. Because the demand for normal fuel, for the same reasons, is higher than the demand for biodiesel, for example, right, or biofuel. Same discussion with putting ethanol in the normal fuel. In Italy, you have 95, right? That means you have 5% other ingredients. In Germany, it was 10%. They wanted to put in 10% bioethanol into the fuel, and no one bought that. And they got rid of the idea again, right? And that's unfortunately, I mean, it always goes back to the easy thing, the cheap thing, the quick thing, right? So you see, I hope you get to see the picture. So nowadays we have algae. As a biomass, you can eat algae, no? Those of you that have been in Japan, they know that they're very famous to eat algae in all forms. It's very tasty, to be honest. Algae are nice for eating. Some of them are also nice for purifying waters, and algae are a form of biosource or biomass that grows very quickly. So algae might be even interesting for getting other products out of it. However, there is no economical process yet to do that. No economical process. I'm not saying that there is not a process, right? There's no economical process. So people we idiots, I should say, from the university, we spend time, we invent processes, we publish, we patent, and then we try to sell the patent, or we try to convince industries to use our process. They do a quick calculation, what does it cost? So biomass doesn't cost anything, perfect, right? So that's cheaper than oil, eventually. But doing everything with the biomass to arrive at the same product that I get from oil adds so many costs that the process becomes economically non-viable. So you have your patent, fine, but I'm not interested in your patent, ciao. And then we're there again, right? The process exists, but not on an economically viable level. And that is where the Green Deal started. I mean, that was noticed by the European Commission. That is why they press now, most of the funding that we can ask for has to be on an applicable level. So we have to move into applications, basically. Then we have chitin as a biosource, right? Chitin is the most abundant natural polymer that we have on Earth, simply because there's more aquatic surface than land, right? After chitin comes cellulose from the trees. So, biorefinery. We need to talk about how to get out the materials in an economically viable way. That is currently, right to start, I mean, there's no way to discuss it, only possible if we have government incentives. It will get obviously much easier once the oil starts to decrease, the oil reservoirs, but we still don't know whether they will ever decrease as much as we can think about it, right? Because we are still waiting that the peak oil is arriving. Now, I don't know whether you've heard it, now with all the ice melting in Greenland, they now start thinking, oh no, below Greenland, there's lots of oil, so without the kilometers of ice on top, I might actually get that. So that's not very promising from a biorefinery point of view. An instability of the oil market might help, but that will create for all of us real economic problems, so that's not a funny scenario. It would be good for biorefinery, but very, 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 very painful. Even if we do not go for economically thinking, it is becoming dangerous from lots of points of view. We have to force on a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. That would help, and that is now the big point at the moment. Development of new compounds and materials, that's nice, right? I could just say I don't want to use polypropylene, I want to use a bioplastic. Problem is that most of our applications of biopropylene do not together with any of the polymers that we can make out of bioplastics. No one of us wants to use a drinking bottle out of plastic that after 1 hour in the sun becomes leaky, right? We're just not from it's from a performance point of view with biomaterials, we're often not there, right? That is why humans have invented the artificial materials, because they wanted something that works better, right? So logically, we're there. Nowadays, we have to rethink and think the process back, but we have to think of novel materials that are bio-based, which are close to the performance, because on the other hand, right, if we produce lots of bottles that after one day are gone, that's not sustainable neither, right? Because then we run into the problem that we don't have enough biomass to do so, because biomass needs time to grow. Then, that's the definition of a biorefinery. So a facility that integrates biomass conversion, processes, and equipment to produce fuels, power, and chemicals from biomass. So here we have some of the keywords that we had at the beginning, right? So, as we said, we need to take the crops or other plants, and we have to get something useful out of them. We have to find a way to use crops and other plants that we do not eat in order to get rid of that problem right from the beginning, or we need to use the residues. Residues is wheat straw, for example, right? We eat the wheat, the straw we could use for other things. We like the olive oil, but we could use the residues for other things, for example, right? Let's have a look, let's compare. We said that we need, in order to make the biomass being applied, we need to find an interception point with the existing chemical industries, right? So this is a classical refinery. So here's the crude oil that you start from, and then you distill it, you manipulate it, and you get all these types of chemicals that are used for chemical production. So this is a picture of some of the, a little bit more, but this contains platform chemicals. So the chemicals that are used in order to start doing chemistry on industrial level to provide us with what we are normally surrounded. So you have, for example, you have propylene here, you have styrene or somewhere, you have acrylic acid, etc., right? Methanol, acetic acid, so all what you need for doing chemistry on an industrial level. That comes from oil. If we want to have the same things from biomass, you can see, without reading in detail, you can see that the things become much more complicated. Because what is oil from a scientific perspective, right? Oil is biomass that has been chemically transformed over millions of years, right? That is oil. So nature, over millions of years, did eventually structural modifications, chemical reactions, that helped us to make this viscous liquid that is easy to use, right? We don't have the millions of years to wait, so we need to find a way, we need to find shortcuts in order to take the biomass and make it into the same products. But these shortcuts if I want to save billions of years, I have to use a couple of shortcuts. And that renders everything much more complicated, as you see, right? So this biorefinery will never be an easy thing. It will never be a quick thing. It will always take some time and good thinking, and then also the awareness that taking a tree and doing a biorefinery process will not give me the same products as taking an annual wheat straw or residues of olive to get the same things out, right? Because I use completely different biomasses to start with. I have differences in crude oil, obviously, right? If I take the North Sea oil, that is different from the one that I get in Saudi Arabia. But at the end of the day, the differences are small compared to the differences that we have in biomasses. So, we have to transform biomass into chemical products of commercial interest. We can produce lots of products out of biomass, right? If they don't have a commercial interest or generate a commercial interest, they are worthless. That's what I just said, right? We need on a research level we need to think basically already of the application when we start thinking of what we could do. Otherwise, we were lost from the beginning. To get that done, we need to deconstruct the biomass, not destroy, but deconstruct. So whatever nature puts together to have the tree standing up and not falling permanently down, we have to take apart. Because we need the three polymers that were named yesterday as structure-giving glue or the cement in the tree, for example. We need to take that apart. I want to have the glue, I want to have the structure-giving material, etc., right? And deconstructing, I mean, if you played with Lego as kids, deconstructing is not always easy because there might be links that you forgot, that you do not see, etc., right? And you risk to break bricks just because they are connected also to other bricks and they're not so easy to disentangle. It's the same idea with biomass, right? Otherwise the tree would fall apart as soon as it rains. So, if I want to have it economically valuable, I need to think of the economy of scale. That is something that is a double-sided sword. Because obviously, if I produce lots of it, things might get cheaper, and my biomass becomes eventually more attractive as a starting point. However, I have to be able, in order to reach the economy of scale, I have to be able to do it on scale, right? Even if mathematically I can always say, look, I produce 1 kilo. If I produce millions of kilos, I can reduce the cost by 90%. Mathematically, I'm there. But from an engineering point of view, and from a resource point of view, as I said, biomass needs time to grow. Am I really there? Can I get there? That's the question, right? So I need to think of the economy of scale, and then eventually this deconstructing takes a lot of time. So I need to construct a biorefinery value chain in order to arrive at biorefinery types. The worst one is I take a single biomass and I make a single product. That's economically not so interesting, right? That's the old-fashioned way. Nowadays, if we want to make it work, we have to think in parallel. So I take multiple sources of biomass. I have a multiple process interconnected, like in the chemical industries, right? BASF has multiple processes connected. They use the same starting materials. They share starting materials. One of them produces a byproduct that can serve as a starting material for another process, etc. We have to do the same thing with biomasses. So multiple sources, multiple products. One plant that does it. This is one of the list of products we can get. This picture is more useful in the sense, so this is now the biorefinery, and I have to make it fit with the petrochemical, or adapt it, or make it comparable to the petrochemical refinery in order to get these starting products. So, the ideas are all old. Some ideas are very old. For example, this is already a wood fractionation that was done in the north of Europe, in Finland, for example, already since 1570. Right? So we had the basic ideas we had already 500 years ago, guys, right? It took us 500 years ago to arrive at the point where we say, look, that was a good idea, now we have to make it work for 8 billion people, right? So let's cut that short. We had processes like wood saccharification, so very early biorefinery processes. This is an industrial process in the 1920s, so 100 years ago, there were already the first industrial processes for producing, for example, ethanol. But then was the war, etc., right? Then came the computer, so no one really cared. And now we're going back, remembering. We have the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. No? You don't study chemistry without knowing what is the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. Also, this can be done starting from biomass, right? And I produce useful gases for the chemical industry. So, going back to the biorefinery from nowadays, so I have different feedstocks. Nowadays we have different pre-treatments and treatments in the biorefinery to get our products out. To deconstruct, so the products we get out for wood, for example, how many minutes do I still have? Few? Okay. We get a few products out. We have cellulose, we have hemicelluloses, and you see the structural differences. We have pectines. We have more pectines, we have lignin, right? So all this is in a tree. And all this I take, so I need to cut a couple of things, to get out some useful chemicals. I can do pre-treatments, so I take wood, for example, I debark it, and I take the bark to get out the tannins, for example, right? And then I take the wood to get out the cellulose and lignin. I can do steam explosion treatments in order to preserve the natural structure of the polymer. So if I'm interested in using the polymer as a polymer, right, the natural polymer as a polymer, I might use a different treatment than as if I'm interested in using the polymer in form of its monomers, right? So this I have to show you. This is the main process to make cellulose for paper. Okay, so if you touch a piece of paper, it's very likely that the cellulose that was used for it came out of these processes. This is the high end of this paper making, of this biomass used for paper production. This is the lignoboost process. This is a huge process done in Scandinavia where they have all the woods, right? You know, in Italy there was also a lot of paper industry in Italy, but it was not competitive with on an economic level with the paper making industries in the north, so it all died, right? Which brought us to the point that now they produce the paper in the north and you ship it 2,000 kilometers to have paper also in Italy, right? So that so far to local production, etc. Then we can make advantages, disadvantages of the different uses. So, as I said, if you take the trees, we have these cellulose as pulps, we have lignins, which you can use. Lignins can be used for fuel, solid fuel, rubber, reinforces, activated carbon, phenolic resins. We make DMSO out of lignin. We make vanillin out of lignin. So the vanillin that you put in your cakes is actually already produced from biomass. It comes from a chemical process, right? The one that you do not pay much for, right? If you want to real the real stuff, you pay a lot. Vanillin is very expensive. If you take the one in powder form that you put in your cakes for 20 cents, that is a chemical product that comes out from a huge chemical process using a tree. Then we have the extractives, as we said before. So that's one thing. I will show you one thing as an example. I really talk too much, I'm very sorry, guys. So this is platform chemicals. So this is just to show you a list of these starting points that I set for the chemical industry in order to get the biomass into a form that becomes interesting for existing chemical industries. So we have diacids, furans, propionic acid, lots of acids in reality. And I don't know how many of you are actually chemists, but you see that the difference in these chemicals here is the number of carbon atoms. So each of them has a specific number of carbon atoms, and if it has, for example, 3 carbon atoms, like the propionic acid, this is the major building block for all the chemicals that have 3, 6, 9, etc. carbons, right? Because you do then modifications chemically on a very simplified level. And I use this. If I want to have something that is based on 4 carbons, I go for another starting point that comes with 4 carbons, right? From the oil, you get all these out of the distillation. At the end of the day, you distill the oil, you manipulate it slightly, and you get these out of the oil. If you take a tree, there is no C3 building block in a tree, right? You saw the structures that I showed you. That's not C3. That's C millions of times. So we have to cut down eventually the polymers in order to get these building blocks that then, obviously, you see here, this is succinic acid that serves for producing other important chemicals, and so on and so on. So how do I cut the tree? I can take the cellulose and cut it down. I had this slide somewhere. Well, I will just tell you. You take the cellulose and you chemically destruct it, basically, right? Controlled in order to make three building blocks. That costs money, obviously, because it's a chemical process, right? And that is the crucial point. That's the bottleneck, because I have to make this cracking, this getting the cellulose plus its conversion into C3 or C6 building blocks, for example, on a very simplified level always, into a process that is economically valuable, and the quality of the C3 has to be in a way that it is directly compatible with the chemical industry. At that point, I'm there. I use biomass for the chemical industry, right? In a carbon neutral way, ideally. If I take care of how to do the transformation. So that would be from a chemical point of view. That's the last, I will finish now with some other applications. I could not destruct it, but I could use the biopolymers as they come, because nature polymerized, so it'd be stupid not to use them as polymers also. So we could use cellulose not only for paper, for example, but also in form of a cellulose spray in buildings, right, as an insulating material. So that would be a biomass-based insulating material. We can use these polyurethane foams that you put across the window. You put a window, you seal it with these foams. They could be bio-based. We could use lignin, as I said, in polyurethane. So these foams would be polyurethanes. They would always look brown, because lignin, as it comes from the industrial processes, looks brown. We can do polymers for recyclable bags for the waste, for example, right? That is doable, that is done. We can make, in order to make money for very selected we can make nanoparticles out of biopolymers. Nanoparticles for industrial applications, for pharmaceutical applications, for cosmesis, right? So for functional cosmetics, for example. That can be done on biomass. That would be a high value added product. So this might bring us some money to make another process that is linked to this one for another part of the biomass, economically valuable, right? That brings us back to the discussion that we have to see it as a whole, right? We have to go away from these single uses, but we have to, right from the start, looking at it as a whole, and then you get nice nanostructures which are the same as the ones derived from oil, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Okay, now it's working. We have time just for one question and one answer or comment. Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, of course, as always. You show macroalgae, microalgae, like phytoplankton. Do they have the same bottleneck as the big thing, big flashy things? Just for me, for my ignorance.
No, I mean, it's a very different type of biosource, right? If you use for growth conditions, what they need for growing, and harvesting is difficult, right? And what you can do with them. So they have a different production of different, all of them produce versatile metabolites that can be extracted, PUFAs, for example, the fatty acids, eventual antioxidants, etc. So that for sure is in all of them, but not to the same level, right? So depending on where you are in the world, where they would grow, depending on what you are interested in, and in what other applications you could use other components that come together with the one that you're really interested in, you would have to choose. As I said, they are currently very much used for water remediation. That would give you the possibility to purify water, which is a crucial point, to take out the metals, for example, or antibiotics. They even consume antibiotics, producing metabolites. I could use some of the metabolites from the antibiotics, or I just keep them in, but I can extract the metals, for example, so I would have a metal recycling practically, and I have a biomass that I can always use as a fertilizer, etc., to get rid of the inorganic fertilizers. But it depends how they grow. It's not so easy. I mean, I know from a project of mine that growing algae artificially is not. It seems easy, but they are a little bit sensitive to surrounding conditions. So they might just not do what they do in the sea. They might just not do in your bioreactor, for example, right?
Thank you very much, Jake.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. So let's move to the next and last speaker of this workshop. Okay. Who is Professor Malfatti from the University of Trieste. She's professor of microbiology there. And so I have to wait for a while.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Andrea, for organizing everything. It was perfectly orchestrated. I have met many new colleagues, and let's hope that this is a new day for us, at least, in this silly Anthropocene. Sorry for the long title. We will focus anyhow. Posso usare questo clicker a destra e a sinistra?
No.
Ok, allora sono sicura che mi sbaglierò. Ok. Despite the title is very long, I would like to explore with you the microbial world. By training, I am a marine microbial ecologist and a biogeochemist. So, you know, the worst of the worst. So today, the menu before lunch would be, let me tell you about who am I or where am I coming from. I will not tell you where am I going, but we will just refresh the Anthropocene, then a short, super short introduction on microbes, And then the main dish of my talk. To my esteemed colleague, if you see a slide that is similar to yours, well, great minds think alike. Let's put it in this way. So this is where I'm coming from. I have been studying at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography with Farouk Azam, a man who has made us possible to quantify, make numbers on tiny microbes. On the right side, you see Judith Mann, the wife of the passed away Dr. Walter Mann, who has helped the Allies to have the math right to land in Normandy, studying tides and water circulation along the coast. On the left side, you see late Dr. Benson, you know, the guy with the Calvin and Benson Bashar cycles. We all have seen Charles David Killing curve and the Killing curve, so that was the environmental milieu within the Anthropocene that we are making and changing. And then I study sea spray aerosol within the Case Center, and late Mario Molina was one of our advisors, and as you have seen, Kratz and Molina won the Nobel Prize since they worked on the ozone hole and the influence of the CFC on this process. My advisor made sure that I understood that the microbes lives in a very complex world that is full of gradients that are ephemeral in time and space. We don't, as humans, we don't perceive us because our world is empty. Between me and you, there are only molecules of waters. We live in a high Reynolds numbers. Instead, the microbial world is different. So if you really want to fish a salmon, think like a salmon. And so today I would like to tell you how you can conceptualize the microbial world. Feynman, another great guy in Caltech who did many things for the electromagnetic world, told us there is plenty of bottom at the bottom for biology. So having a mechanistic point of view, usually I think we need to integrate all these approaches in order to solve unsolvable problems and ask new questions or answer old questions. This is what we have done. Sorry if this is kind of Walt Disney or baby cartoons. We moved our planet from a natural point of view to an anthropocentric or impacted landscape. And so we are pervasive forces at any level within our planet. We all have seen the great acceleration, and here I'm just showing, sorry I forgot the citation, all the trends that are within the natural system that finally we are able to measure. So the limit is no more the sky. We have seen that many mass extinction, and these are the dinos in one of their retreats talking to each other and said, look, we have a big problem, gentlemen. We are not really so smart, and the mammals are taking over, and the climate is changing. So really, we don't want to be, nor to act like a dino. Where are we? What do we need? We are all scientists, so we want to reduce uncertainty. And within my talk, I would like to tell you that microbes are everywhere. They are constantly shaping our life and planet Earth, and they may be habitable for us. And we as a scientist, we need to reduce the uncertainty, the error bars in order to have a stronger punchline message to everybody. Not brainwashing, just a science-based message with data. So here is the IPCC table where you can see that either we are trying to warm our planet or we can cool our planet as long as we understand how the natural system works and where are the microbes with it. Already people, our colleagues show us the planetary boundaries because, you know, I am a marine microbial ecologist or a microbiologist, so I work with something that nobody can see if you don't have a microscope. And so it's very difficult to portray the message. Microbes were here first, and they will be also here last, and they are helping us. And so this is why you need to fund me and give me money in order to help society as well. So in Stockholm, the Resilience Center in 2009 has published this concept of planetary boundaries in order to tell people, hey, I put you in the map within the ecosystem, but you know what? If we split our Earth based on processes that we have data and we can quantify, sometimes we are not in a good spot. For instance, biosphere integrity or biogeochemical flows that have been messed up because of our action. So maybe you should do something to not overdrive the system, since then you don't know where you are going. It's driving blind. We don't want to go there. Certain things, as we have seen, novel entities that can be used as a proxy or atmospheric loading have really no data to guide us. Where are we going? Microbes, I give it away already the message because it deserves first, you know, and it's about lunchtime. So microbes have been here first. Microbe and life are intertwined in terms of concept. They have invented biochemistry. They are very diverse and productive. They are everywhere in us, within us, with our dogs and plants, in the air, as we know, in the soil and in the water reservoir. They made the Earth habitable and they keep the ecosystem functioning. Where do we start? Well, first of all, we need to scale back, and let me tell you where are we. We are at the interface. Microbes works at the interface with molecules, so they are really, really tiny. We are 10 to the minus 6 meter, 10 to the minus 9 meter. So if we now use an analogy and we think 1 meter box, and then we do 10x jump, and we think a baseball, a marble, and a grain of salt, and then we scale that. The grain of salt is a 1 meter box. We are here, minus 5, minus 6 meters of our life. The microscale doesn't stop there. We have seen the chemists telling us that there are molecules, and here you are. You have other bacteria, viruses, atoms, and molecules. And bacteria and viruses and archaea are constantly changing the molecules, and their effect is visible today. Think about the oxygen, think about the CO2. You cannot see very well, but this is a microbial sky. So this is how bacteria in the water looks like. They are little blue dots. But we need high-resolution tools in order to see what they are doing, in order to characterizing and making numbers. These are not just pretty pictures. Here you see an Escherichia coli, our lab rat, and here you see an example of marine symbiosis we have discovered, and this is an atomic force microscopy topography image. Viruses are part of the deal. They are really hardcore killers, and they keep in check microbial abundance, and also sometimes eukaryotes. And the other flavor that also Donatello has told us are, there are bacteria, there are boys, and there are girls, there are archaea in life, and they are all contributing to system stability and ecosystem functioning. This is how also you can conceptualize bacteria species. So a little tiny colonies has at least 1 billion cells, but still they are not really taking over because there is ecology, there is prey predator, there is resource partitioning and the competition for resources. So life, as you can see, finally the Dona sapiens arrived. So it's not our fault, it's their fault. But anyhow, life happened very, very early on our planet, so 3.9 billions, and then it took a while to become a boy and a girl, bacteria and archaea, and then we have all the great things that you have studied and seen yesterday. But before life as we know it in the cellular way, there was a non-cellular, out of the box, if you think, life that we can define, and this is a magnificent picture from David Goodsell, where he is depicting the interaction at the interface with the building blocks that probably has then been compartmentalized and kept the reaction and the product within a double layer, a bilayer, and so they were not diffusing anymore. Think about how Earth is big. Think about all the potential interfaces that have been happening and developing within our billions of years, and still we still don't know how life happened, and so it's still really interesting and challenging. This is just for you. And this is the other cartoon that I was yesterday bragging about. Bacteria and archaea are everywhere. They are still evolving. And how they are doing it, sometimes they send us text messages in the forms of nucleic material, storage, informations. Because usually, this is another great artist that I like, Ray Troll, it's never too late to mutate. And Darwin, is riding the eVolvo car. So this is what is happening from the microbial side. We are a little bit not so efficient in mutate, and sometimes doesn't work really well for us. Bacteria are really diverse, really small, and they are everywhere within the ecosystem. And if you remember about the planetary boundaries, they are interesting for us in terms of, I think we agree, in trying to guide the society in maintaining a certain level of ecosystem services that today we had a great introduction about. So still, maybe I haven't explained you microbes, planetary scale, larger scale. Well, when you think about this definition, allow me to use regulating services, the provisioning services in terms of seafood, biomaterial, or climate regulation, or water quality. You are talking without knowing about the silent action that microbes do, changing molecules one at a time, constantly. Because microbes are the best environmental engineer that we know about. They are constantly recycling organic matter, remineralizing, letting go the nutrients that they don't need, and these keep the ecosystem going. We know primary productivity, CO2 fixation is really important for us, for everybody, for everything on this planet. So we can ask, how they are doing it? They are doing it at a small scale, interacting with oxygen. Think about oxygen production and the degradation of organic matter. Then they have always been here since the beginning, and they are still changing and adapting. In 2016, Japanese colleagues have discovered a PET degrading bacterium. That's wonderful. Now we need just to optimize the reaction to be a little bit more high processivity of that two-step enzymes. And they are in every environment. So this is where I place, and this is where Farouk Azam and I have placed bacteria and archaea in the center of ecosystem within the great biogeochemical cycles, and this can happen every time you have biomass, so in the water, in the lake, on the sediment, in the soil, in the deep subsurface, and also in the water, in the air. We know that there is a huge biomass of microbes everywhere, also in what we call the biosphere, in us, on the animal, on the plant, and they are constantly, if you think, exchanging messages, exchanging products. They are really small. They are responsible for 90% of the respiration of organic matter in the ocean, and also they represent the 90% of the biomass, at least in this oceanic environment. And you can find them, also Donato mentioned that, deep down in the core of the Earth, or almost, and they are extremely slow in slowing and changing, but they are still there doing something. When you breathe air, don't forget that there are bacteria and viruses. So we as humans are leaving our fingerprint as we are speaking or as we are coughing, but also the other creatures on Earth are leaving their microbial signature in the aerosols. So you can count about 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 6 cells per liter of air. In the water, we have up to 1 times 10 to the 9 cells per liter. In the sediment, you have about 1 times 10 to the 9 per gram of sediments, are everywhere. Again, they given the earth that is a lovely place because we have the water structure being able to be in 3 different forms. Microbes are using all the possible spaces that we can find. And here are all the different microbial environments. So within this free slide, I would like you to think that the microbes have invented biochemistry. There are all the environments are colonized, inhabited, changed by microbes. They are doing pretty much the same thing. Monod said there is really not much big difference between an Escherichia coli and an elephant from a biochemical point of view. So there are some chemistry and physics that define niches. You can think about our body as an extreme environment when we are healthy, when we are not. There are districts with low pH or higher pH, and then the oxygen changes within our body, and microbes are there and are keeping us functioning. So this is a fantastic article, a review from Cavicchioli, all the greatest microbiology. I'm not there, so you should read it, where they are conceptualizing within a earth that is changing within the Anthropocene, all the possible functions and processes that are changing, and we still don't know where is the trajectory driven by microbes. From the night lab, what we know is that as we have one ocean, as we have one atmosphere, because these 2 spheres are constantly flowing and changing within and connecting different locations in our earth, also the different microbiome, they share a current interconnection pattern. So also microbes are connecting us, and this is the fil rouge of life, if you like. We know that we are like the stars, but we are a little bit less enriched in hydrogen and helium relative to the stars in the universe, but life has started cycling these elements, and this is what microbes do at the microbial scale. So biogeochemistry, nothing else, means reduction and oxidation of elements, moving them from soluble to insoluble state in a different form. Donato showed us this and how then we can map it within the grand scheme that Falkowski laid out in this beautiful paper about redox and geo and atmospheric influence within the biogeochemical cycles and the metabolism that microbes do in the ocean. On Earth. And this is again all the terrible metabolic chart that we have, all the studies, and how when you are moving carbon, you are moving, for instance, iron, but you are moving also new pharmaceuticals that we have created, you are moving new pollutants, you are moving probably also radionuclides. So everything is interconnected at the microbial scale. Let me tell you about how you can think to be a microbe. You can close your eyes and start smelling, and that's pretty much it. They are driving blind, but they feel gradients in a very fast way. They compare, this situation is better or worse than the other one. Like when you go to see the eye doctor that tells you better or worse than before, this is what microbes do. So they don't have a long-term memory, but actually they can make decisions. So within the microscale, you can think about a continuum of physical shape and size of organic matter that is a gel-like structure, whereas microbes are swimming and rubbing themselves against it. They don't have mouth, but they have enzymes, or they release enzymes in the environment that they chop down molecules, and then they have uptake system in order to exploit what they have done. So imagine that they have stomachs all over the place. And their gradient, they don't know what will happen within their microscale. So gradient appears and dissipates because of life and death of our organisms that can be microbially induced or not. Think daylight and sunlight. All the photosynthetic bacteria becomes from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde. They stop fixing oxygen and they become like virtually an heterotroph. Usually microbial ecologists work during the day, so the night is under sample. And there are different sources. This is a fecal pellets of a copepod or of a little crab. So it's pretty good food, actually, super energetic that microbes can use. This is a dead algae that is releasing some organic matter. And bacteria and archaea, if they can go and they move, they go there and get it. The world that they are living is a world full of stuff. And this is an example because I haven't found a molecular picture of it, of a bacterium within ourselves. But this within ourselves, you can think about that at the microscale, there are always molecules touching the bacterium and the archaeum, and they need to make a decision of what to do, which is the physiology, the gene expression that I need to turn on in order to have a better fitness in comparison to my colleagues. Across the scale, we are positioning way out there to the left size, and so the fact that they are living in a microbial environment with, and their consequences are large scale, they have learned how to deal with molecules, how to deal with high viscosity fields, and what is the best way to navigate. So they don't use echolocation or vision in their environment, but they really smell, chemomechanical smelling of the place, and then deciding where to go. This is how bacteria and archaea do it. They are very versatile, they have invented it all, and if we chart, we are eukaryotes, really pretty sad in terms of all the metabolic and functional diversity that we see within the great microbial microenvironment. Everywhere in the ocean or in the lake we have remineralization of organic matter, the same thing that happened in the soil in the litter strata, and also in the sediment. So also when we go and collect the sediment, we can ask, for instance, by using metagenomic approach, what are they doing at the macro scale, and what is and why these, or how can use this information to manage polluted sediment. This is an example in the Venice Lagoon that has seen it all, the Venice Lagoon, and still will it seen it a lot if the Mose doesn't rise at the right time. But at the same question you can ask within the metagenomic data, do I see microscale interaction? Do I see microscale function that are telling me what is the ecology and what is the behavior of the microbes over there? And here I give you some examples. Microbes like to, as I said, text message themselves using DNA, and sometimes they use a type 4 pillows, so that is a straw where they shoot some part of DNA that then can be taken up, or sometimes they like to pierce each other. So sediment, as every other microbial environment, is highly competitive, and the antibiotics at the microbial level needs to kill the others, not necessarily are an invention of humans. So microbes have seen it before. This is why they are so well in digging and dodging, and we have the antimicrobial resistance problem at the global level. With the type 6 pili, they like to poke some other microbes, or maybe us, and that creates enormous consequences in terms of life and death. I talked and I didn't talk about water and sediment, and now let's take the last breath, let's take a good breath of air, and you know, besides viruses and microbes, there are also many different particles and signatures that can tell us where the air was before and what it's carrying. So we have, for instance, the dust of the Sahara in orange. We have the burning fire of the Amazon, unfortunately, where we see some forest that is burning in green. Then we have white as a signature of human industry, and then we have blue, finally, some blue, from the aerosol that is emitted when a wave crashes. Particles are ejected, so there is a really tight connection between oceans, lakes, and the atmosphere. Sorry. And we know that per meter square of ocean, we have an exchange from times 10 to the 4 to 10 to the 7 cells. And when they are in the atmosphere, and when they are in the sea spray aerosol, they can change the chemistry of and the behavior of the atmosphere. That means they can serve as nuclei for making clouds, nuclei for making also ice, that then will form raindrops or dry snow, precipitation, and also they change overall the radiative balance of our planet by creating, for instance, more clouds, promoting albedo, and so we have a higher refraction of the sunlight. I work also in this setting, is a 30 meters aquarium with a break, wave break, and so we do controlled laboratory experiment. We have tried to reduce the complexity from the ocean, bring back to the atmosphere, and then make it even more complex by having a multidisciplinary teams of people. And so what we have discovered is that microbes are ejected. There is a kind of specificities within the ejection that depends on the chemistry and the physics of the sea surface microlayer, the skin of the ocean. This is important because if you go swimming in a lake or in the sea where there is a wastewater system and you are downwind, maybe you breathe some microbes that you don't want to breathe it, for instance, or maybe they are changing the local properties of the environment. We were able to measure active enzymes, so microbes, once they are ejected, they are alive, they can do things, they can grow, but they can degrade the organic matter, and so they are really very good chemists in changing the chemical dynamics within the atmospheres in terms of inorganic and organic molecules, because according of the coating that you have in these microbubbles, in our case is the ocean, reactivity with NOx species is altered potentially by just chewing some protein. And these are microbes. And so I'm finishing, sorry if I was super late. What I am trying to do, and a possible solution is focusing of microbial activities at the microscale, developing new methods to assess and putting numbers in realistic condition scenarios. And what you see is a 0.5 microliter of waters with at least 120 cells. These are microalgae, and the green cells are bacteria. Viruses are not imaged, and they are alive. So I think overall goal from Farouk Azam and myself as his scientific, one of his scientific daughter, will be try to make a stronger link from microscale processes to larger scale processes in order to inform society and put more details within the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Also, no, stay here, please. Maybe one question or more. So thank you very much for teaching us how to, think like a microbe. Any questions, comments? Nice. So, thank you very much, Francesca, again, for your speech. So, we change the microphone. Okay. So, thank you very much for attending this workshop. Thank you to the speaker. If I'm allowed just a few words towards the PhD student and master student that attended. So
So I hope you appreciated the effort and the speaker and the organizer put in presenting different aspects, very intercorrelated, very complementary. Of course, it's not possible to address such a big topic in 1 day and a half, but we hope that we at least stimulated your curiosity to go and read and download paper, but mainly you have the luck to be in very interdisciplinary PhD course, because you have chemistry, you have environmental science, you have geology, earth sciences. So please interact yourself, go to the other colleagues and try to find a way to collaborate, because these complex things can be addressed, can be faced only towards an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach. And thank you very much for coming.